Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable and history is allowed to unfold at a pace gentle enough for a tired mind. Tonight, we're heading into one of the strangest archaeological stories on Earth, and it begins in a place that does not look especially friendly to the living, let alone kind to the dead. We're going to the Tarim Basin in what is now Western China, where the desert keeps its secrets so well that when some of them finally emerge from the sand, they seemed less like remains and more like people who had only just decided to lie down for a while. And yet, as remarkable as their faces were, as striking as their clothes were, and as eerie as their preservation seemed, the real surprise was waiting much deeper down, tucked inside their cells, locked away in the faint and fragile chemistry of ancient DNA. Because when scientists began to test who these people were and where they came from, the answer was not the one anyone had been expecting. Before we get into that, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you winding down after a long day, tucked under a blanket, sitting in low light with a cup of tea you forgot to finish while it was still hot? Or is it one of those late hours when the world gets quieter and history somehow feels closer, as though old stories become easier to hear once modern life stops making quite so much noise? And while you are there in your own corner of the evening, what time is it for you right now? It feels fitting somehow, because this story is full of distance. Distance in years, distance in geography, and distance between what people assumed and what the evidence eventually said. If you find this kind of slow journey soothing or interesting, or simply a pleasant way to end the day without someone shouting facts at you over dramatic music, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner reach other people who enjoy learning about the world at a more human speed. And now, with that said, let us make our way toward the desert. The Tarim Basin is one of those places that sounds almost invented when you first hear about it, as though it belongs in an old adventure novel written by someone with a strong fondness for maps and a mild disregard for comfort. It lies in a vast depression ringed by mountains, with the Taklamakan Desert spread across much of its interior, a place known for extremes of dryness, heat, cold, wind, and general hostility to any creature that was hoping for an easy afternoon. It is not the sort of landscape that invites casual wandering. It is the sort that makes you think very carefully about water, direction, and whether you have made several poor decisions in a row. And yet for thousands of years, people lived around it, crossed parts of it, traded through it, and buried their dead in its margins. Now, deserts have a reputation for emptiness, but archaeologically speaking, emptiness can be deceptive. A place that seems barren may preserve what wetter landscapes quickly destroy. Moisture, after all, is wonderfully helpful if you're a tree or a mushroom, but it is terrible news if you are trying to remain recognizable for several thousand years. In a dry, salty, cold and windy environment, decay can be slowed so dramatically that human bodies may survive with an unsettling degree of detail. Hair remains, skin remains, clothing remains, even expressions in a loose and imperfect sense seem to remain. That is part of what made the finds in the Tarim Basin so arresting. These were not skeletons in the ordinary way people imagine ancient burials. These were mummies, naturally preserved by the environment, with faces and textiles and body shapes that made the ancient past feel uncomfortably close. And that word, mummy, does have a way of making the mind run off in the wrong direction. One immediately thinks of Egypt, gold masks, tomb chambers, curses, perhaps an unwise British archaeologist in linen behaving far too confidently around something sealed for 3,000 years. But the Tarim Basin mummies belong to a very different world. They were not prepared with the elaborate embalming methods used along the Nile. They were preserved by chance, or perhaps by a combination of environmental luck and burial practice that happened to work astonishingly well. No great stone pyramids, no polished sarcophagi, no royal cobra motifs glaring from every available surface. Just dry ground, cold conditions, careful burials, and time doing something very unusual for once, which was not erasing the evidence as quickly as usual. When these mummies became more widely known, people were struck by how vivid they seemed. Some had light brown hair, some wore woven wool, some were buried with hats, baskets, boots, or objects that hinted at ordinary routines interrupted by death, and then resumed, in a sense, by archaeology. You could look at them and feel the deeply inconvenient realization that the ancient dead were not ancient to themselves. They were people with sore feet, family habits, favourite tools, dull errands, and probably at least one opinion about the weather that was repeated more often than anyone wanted. That is always one of the odd gifts of archaeology. It takes the grand past and quietly returns to it the details of daily life. But from the very beginning, there was something else about these mummies that tugged at the imagination. They did not fit neatly into the picture many people expected of the ancient population history of that region. Their appearance led to speculation, and speculation, as it so often does, got busy almost immediately. Some observers looked at the textiles, the body features, or the burial goods and began constructing large, confident explanations. Perhaps they were migrants from far to the west. Perhaps they were early Indo-European speakers moving through Inner Asia. Perhaps they were evidence of some ancient branch of a people already known from elsewhere. Perhaps they were proof of sweeping movements across Eurasia that would connect them to cultures separated by huge distances. And because human beings are very fond of tidy origins, the story quickly developed into a kind of historical puzzle in which everyone seemed determined to find the missing matching piece. That, as it turns out, is often the moment when the real world prepares to be awkward. Because the ancient world was not designed for our convenience, it does not line up politely according to the categories we like best. Populations mix, divide, isolate, move, stay put, adopt customs, trade ideas, change languages, borrow clothing styles, and generally behave in ways that make simple labels rather difficult to maintain over several millennia. Archaeology is full of cases where the artifacts suggest one kind of connection, language suggests another, and genetics turns up at the door carrying a third answer entirely, looking faintly annoyed that no one waited for it before writing the script. The Tarim Basin mummies became famous partly because they seemed to invite a dramatic origin story. You could see why. Here were remarkably preserved ancient people in a harsh desert basin, at the eastern edge of the broader world many Western audiences were used to imagining. Their burials were striking, their clothes were striking, their survival was striking. Even their faces seemed to ask for explanation. And once that happens, once a discovery acquires a dramatic visual identity, public imagination is not usually content with a modest answer. It wants caravans, lost tribes, vanished kingdoms, grand migrations, and preferably at least one sentence containing the phrase rewriting history, ideally said by someone standing in wind. Still, the real story is more interesting than the dramatic version, because it tells us something important about how the ancient world actually worked. Not as a neat map of arrows all pointing in sensible directions, but as a deep and tangled record of communities adapting to extreme environments, preserving old ancestry, meeting new neighbours, and leaving traces that only make sense when several kinds of evidence are read together. The mummies did not simply present one mystery. They presented layers of them. Who were they biologically? What culture did they belong to? How isolated were they? How connected were they? Why were they buried the way they were? How did they survive so well in the ground? And perhaps most unsettlingly for anyone who enjoys certainty, how much of what we thought we knew about early people in this region was based on assumptions that had gone untested for far too long? There is also something especially compelling about desert discoveries, because deserts do not just preserve bodies, they preserve moments. A boot survives, and suddenly a person has a sense of practicality. A woven basket survives, and someone's hands come back into view. A strand of hair survives, and for one brief second the ancient past stops being made of stone tools and dates and becomes personal. In the Tarim Basin, this effect is particularly strong. The mummies are ancient, yes, but they are also stubbornly individual. They do not melt into the background of history. They hold their shape. They keep their presence. Even photographs of them tend to unsettle people in a very specific way because they seem to collapse distance. 500 years can feel abstract, 3,000 years even more so. But a face with eyelashes and a woven cap is difficult to file away as remote, and then the science entered the picture more fully, which is usually the point where some mysteries become clearer and others become worse in the best possible sense. Archaeology had already given scholars the physical remains, the burial sites, the environmental context, the tools, the textiles, the clues of diet and routine. But DNA had the potential to ask a different question. Not what they looked like, not only how they lived, but how they were related to other human groups. And because ancient DNA has transformed the study of prehistory in the last couple of decades, there was reason to think it might settle long-standing debates. At the very least, it would reduce the number of people confidently guessing based on cheekbones and wool patterns, which is not always a bad service to scholarship. Yet ancient DNA is not magic. It is delicate, difficult, and frequently ruined by time, temperature, contamination, and the basic fact that molecules do not exist solely for our convenience. Pulling usable genetic material from very old remains is a technical challenge, even under decent conditions, and decent conditions are not always available when the remains in question have spent thousands of years in a desert basin, better known for drying corpses than assisting laboratory workflows. But when the data did come through, it opened a door onto a past stranger than many people had assumed. The result, put simply, was that the Tarim Basin mummies did not line up cleanly with the populations many expected them to resemble. They were not a simple case of newcomers from one obvious outside source, arriving wholesale and explaining everything. Their ancestry pointed instead towards something older, deeper, and more isolated than that. The people buried there seemed to preserve a lineage that had become rare elsewhere, a lineage reaching back into ancient populations of Eurasia in a way that made them stand out not because they fit a familiar migration story, but because they did not. They were, in a sense, both local and surprising, rooted and unusual, connected to the wider human past certainly, but not in the tidy manner earlier theories preferred. That is the heart of the mystery we are stepping into tonight. Not simply, who were these mummies? But why their answer resisted the categories waiting for them, why their bodies looked like one kind of clue, why their material culture suggested another set of relationships, and why their DNA insisted on a more complicated story. Human history has a habit of being richer than our first guesses, and sometimes the most revealing discoveries are the ones that refuse to behave. There is another reason this story matters. It is not just about one burial ground or one set of remains. It is about how we imagine the ancient world itself. We often picture the past in blocks. Civilizations here, cultures there, routes running between them like labelled strings on a school map. But real people didn't live inside our diagrams. They lived in landscapes, traded across difficult distances, adapted to changing climates, inherited genes from populations whose names we do not know, and created identities that cannot always be reconstructed from a single line of evidence. The Tarim Basin mummies remind us that ancient Eurasia was not a blank space between centres of civilization. It was full of communities with their own histories, their own continuity, and their own place in the wider human story. And then there is the simple emotional pull of it, which should not be ignored just because science is involved. There is something deeply arresting about the idea that a group of people could live and die in a desert basin thousands of years ago, be preserved by a combination of climate and burial practice, and then return to public view in a completely different political, cultural, and scientific world. They did not know they were becoming a mystery. They were not posing for museum labels. They were just living where they lived, raising children, burying their dead, managing food, dealing with weather, making cloth, building habits, solving practical problems, and moving through ordinary human life. It is only from our side of time that they become extraordinary, which, oddly enough, may be one of the reasons stories like this linger in the mind so well. They begin with a dramatic image, preserved bodies in desert graves, but they do not stay there. They broaden into questions about ancestry, identity, adaptation, contact, and isolation. They remind us that the past is not a single road leading inevitably to the present. It is more like a landscape full of routes taken, routes abandoned, and routes that left traces only in bone, fabric, and genes. The Tarim mummies sit right at the intersection of those kinds of evidence, which is why they have fascinated archaeologists, geneticists, historians, and, naturally, anyone who has ever seen a photograph of one and thought, quite reasonably, good heavens. So as we continue, we are going to move carefully through that landscape. We will look at where these burials were found, and what made the setting so effective at preserving them. We will consider what the graves themselves reveal, and how early interpretations formed around them. We will spend some time with the practical details of life in the basin, because ancient mystery is all very well, but people still had to eat breakfast. And then we will get to the genetic evidence that shifted the conversation so sharply, not as a dramatic twist for its own sake, but because it genuinely changed how this population could be understood. For now, though, it is enough to stand at the edge of the desert and see the outline of the problem. Ancient bodies in Western China, remarkable preservation, unusual burials, a setting shaped by extreme dryness and long-distance contact. And beneath all of it, a question that grew stranger the closer scientists looked. These people had been in the ground for thousands of years, and when their DNA was finally read, it did not greet the modern world by confirming the neatest theory on offer. It did something much more interesting. It reminded us that the past still has the ability to surprise people who thought they were asking the right questions. And to understand why those graves survived as they did, and why the sand gave them back in such an unsettlingly human form, we need to start with the desert itself, and with the graves that lay waiting beneath it. What made these burials so arresting was not only the fact that ancient bodies had survived in the Tarim Basin at all, but the way the graves themselves seemed to insist on being noticed. The Xiaohe cemetery was not a quiet little patch of sand that happened to contain a few old bones. It was built on a mound roughly 7 meters high, 74 meters long, and 35 meters wide, and by the time the site was properly excavated in the early 2000s, archaeologists had documented 179 graves there, with estimates suggesting the total number of burials at the site may originally have been closer to 350, once erosion and looting are taken into account. The place had first been identified in the early 20th century, and documented by the Swedish archaeologist Folke Bergman in 1934. But its full significance only became clear much later, after rediscovery and systematic excavation. Even from a distance, the cemetery would not have looked ordinary. It rose from the desert as an artificial mound marked by upright timbers and carefully arranged funerary architecture, more deliberate than accidental, more communal than improvised. This was not a random scatter of deaths. It was a burial ground used generation after generation by people who knew exactly what they were doing when they brought their dead here. Part of the reason the site made such an impression on early explorers and later archaeologists is that it seems almost absurd in its setting. Today the broader region is extremely dry, barren, and difficult, but environmental studies suggest that during the period when Xiaohe was in use, the people there were living in a well-developed oasis surrounded by extensive desert. Pollen, plant remains, and other environmental evidence point to oasis vegetation that included poplar, reed, and marsh plants, while the lands beyond were dominated by drought-resistant species. That matters because it means the cemetery belonged to a real working landscape, not some fantasy outpost in the middle of nowhere. There were water sources, seasonal cycles, grazing possibilities, and enough local ecological stability to support a community that farmed and herded animals. At the same time, the desert remained close enough and dry enough to become an unlikely accomplice in preserving the dead. The people of Xiaohe were not burying their relatives in empty wasteland. They were burying them at the edge of a fragile, life-supporting oasis that sat in constant tension with the surrounding sands. The cemetery itself was layered, and that layering matters because it tells us that this was not a single dramatic event, but a place returned to over time. Archaeologists divided the site into sections and phases, with 5 layers recognised in the main southern area of Xiaohe, and 2 broad chronological phases now usually discussed for the site. The excavated burials span roughly the early to Middle Bronze Age, around 2000 to 1450 or 1400 BCE, depending on the study and calibration. This means that when we talk about the graves beneath the sand, we're not really talking about one moment frozen in place. We're talking about decades and centuries of repeated burial, repeated ritual, repeated choices about how to construct a coffin, how to orient a body, how to mark a grave, and how to distinguish the dead from the shifting landscape around them. The mound itself grew through use. One burial was placed, then another, until the cemetery became a built memory in sand and timber. That is one reason the site feels so organised. It was organised. Its final shape was created by accumulated acts of mourning. The most famous detail, of course, is the coffins. At Xiaohe, the dead were buried in narrow wooden coffins that archaeologists repeatedly describe as boat-shaped or boat-like, generally without bottoms, covered by wooden lids and then by cattle hides. Later discussions of the site have emphasised that the coffins were often buried upside down in pits dug into the sand, making the vessel analogy even more striking. It is one of those details that sounds too neat to be true, but it appears again and again in archaeological descriptions of the cemetery. These were not standard rectangular boxes in the way most modern people picture coffins. They were long, narrow, carefully made forms, sometimes straight and sometimes slightly curved depending on phase, built from planks and covered with hides. The use of cattle skin was not incidental either. At Xiaohe, cattle appear to have mattered a great deal, not only economically but symbolically, and graves could include cattle hides, bovine skulls, and other cattle-related offerings. Even before anyone starts arguing about what the coffins meant, the practical image is memorable enough. A wooden vessel sealed with animal hide set into sand in a desert cemetery. You can understand why the site has been difficult for both archaeologists and the public to forget. Some of the more detailed grave descriptions make the construction feel even more specific and less like a general impression. In the published descriptions of individual Xiaohe burials, the container of the dead is described as consisting of 2 arc-shaped side planks, a lid formed by a series of short straight boards, connection boards, and multiple large pieces of oxhide laid over the top. Thin twigs, including tamarisk, could be placed on the hide covering, and posts stood in front of the coffin. These are small details, but they matter because they show a standardised practice, repeated with enough consistency to be recognisable. The mourners were not simply digging holes and improvising. They were following a routine with familiar parts, a specific wooden construction, a hide covering, vegetal material, grave markers, body placement, and a consistent sense of how the dead should be enclosed. The grave was not merely a place to put a body out of sight, it was an assembled setting. Then there were the posts. If the boat-shaped coffins are the most famous feature, the posts are probably the second. Many Xiaohe burials were marked by upright poles placed at the head of the coffin, and those poles have drawn a great deal of interpretation because they were not all shaped the same way. Some researchers have described one form as phallic and another as vulvar, and this interpretation has circulated widely in discussions of the site. But the situation is not as neat as it is sometimes presented in simplified retellings. A recent review of the cemetery notes that while such gendered symbolism has often been proposed, the association is not always consistent, with some female burials paired with so-called male posts, and some male burials paired with so-called female ones. That does not mean the posts were meaningless, quite the opposite. It probably means they were meaningful in ways we do not yet fully understand. The danger with dramatic sites is that they tempt people into confident symbolic explanations, before the evidence has finished speaking. At Xiaowei, the posts clearly mattered, but whether they marked gender directly, encoded ritual categories, expressed lineage, or served some other function remains open to debate. What is certain is that the cemetery was visually distinctive. A field of marked coffins on a sand mound would have looked deliberate from any angle. The site also contained more unusual structures that remind us the cemetery was not entirely uniform. Most burials belong to the main boat coffin pattern, but archaeologists have also identified a small number of more elaborate graves, and at least one unique structure in the northern section of the site, built as a rectangular chamber of wooden poles and planks, covered in cattle skin and topped with layers of cattle skulls. Notably, no human bones were found inside that chamber, which raises the possibility that it was not a burial at all, or at least not a burial in the straightforward sense. There were also a few graves at Xiaohei where the coffin had an outer clay shell, and these have been associated with female burials, perhaps of higher status, though that conclusion should still be handled carefully. What matters for the narration here is that Xiaohei was not monotonous. It had a dominant funerary grammar, yes, but within that grammar there were emphases, variations, and perhaps distinctions in status, role, or ritual treatment. In other words, this was a real cemetery used by a real society, not a museum exhibit designed to make one point very clearly for future viewers. Another site, Gumugu, helps clarify just how distinctive the burial world of the early Tarim Basin was, while also showing that Xiaowei was part of a broader local tradition, rather than a complete one-off. Gumugu, also in the Lop-Nua region, is an early Bronze Age cemetery with around 42 graves, and it shares several features with Xiaohei. Sandy location, wooden coffins, bodies laid straight on the back, and the use of boat-like constructions without bottoms. But Gumugu also includes a second burial type that looks quite different, with graves enclosed by concentric rows of poles, forming what researchers have called a sun-radiating or sun-spoke pattern. A recent archaeoastronomical study found that Gumugu burials were consistently oriented toward the east and correlated significantly with sunrise positions on the horizon, with some evidence suggesting construction around the spring and autumn equinoxes. That does not mean every grave in the region came with a tidy explanation involving astronomy, but it does tell us that orientation and symbolism were likely important. These cemeteries were not just disposal grounds, they were structured ritual landscapes. People were thinking about direction, visibility, marking and placement. And because both Xiaohei and Gumugu sit in this same wider funerary horizon, it becomes easier to see the graves not as isolated oddities, but as part of a local Bronze Age way of dealing with death. The cemeteries were located in sandy areas. The coffins were wooden and often boat-shaped. The dead were laid out individually and extended on their backs. Monuments in the form of poles or wooden markers accompanied the burials. At Xiaohei especially, the dead could be dressed, wrapped and surrounded by grave goods that included combs, baskets, twigs, textiles, leather bags, grains and animal-related objects. Some burials preserved woolen garments and headwear so well that they feel almost intrusive to look at. It is one thing to find a skull, it is another to find the dead still dressed. The more intact the burial, the less distance there seems to be between then and now, and Xiaohei repeatedly forced archaeologists into that uncomfortable closeness. That closeness was made possible by the burial environment as much as by the rituals themselves. Multiple studies point to the dry, sandy, well-drained conditions at Xiaohei as a key reason for the excellent preservation of the human remains and organic materials. In the simplest terms, the dead were placed in an environment where decay had fewer tools to work with. The arid desert conditions, the nature of the sand, the tight enclosure of the coffin, and possibly the covering materials all help create the sort of setting in which bodies could desiccate rather than rot quickly. Textile fibres, leather, wooden objects, plant remains, and even traces of food or dairy residues could survive. This is why Xiaohei has produced so much more than bones. It has produced clothing, baskets, botanical remains, traces of cattle use, and the kind of intimate physical evidence that usually disappears long before archaeology arrives. Deserts can be brutal to the living, but under the right circumstances they can be unexpectedly generous to the dead. There is also a practical point here that often gets overshadowed by the mystery. These graves did not preserve themselves only because the climate was kind. The people burying their dead were choosing materials available in their oasis world. Poplar wood, reeds, hides, cattle products, twigs, and grains all appear in the funerary record because they were part of daily life as well. The cemetery was not separate from the economy. It reflected it. A community that herded cattle and used their hides in burial was drawing directly from its livelihood. A community that placed grains in tombs or wrapped the dead in wool was not making theatrical gestures for archaeologists. It was using the language of the living world to address death. In that sense, the graves beneath the sand are not only records of belief but records of routine. You can see, indirectly, what these people raised, what they processed, what they valued enough to place beside the dead, and what materials were important enough to repeat over many burials. Of course, not every grave survived untouched. Looting and erosion have both damaged the site, and even Bergman's original 1934 excavations encountered burials already plundered. This matters because it introduces one of archaeology's usual frustrations. The most dramatic sites are often the ones other people notice first. By the time careful excavation begins, parts of the original arrangement may already be gone. Objects are displaced, layers are disturbed, organic materials are exposed and damaged. A burial ground like Xiaohe therefore has to be reconstructed from what remained intact, what was recorded in time, and what can be inferred from pattern. That is one reason the large-scale excavations of the early 2000s were so important. They moved the site from rumour and visual fascination into something more systematic. Hundreds of years after the people of Xiaohe used this mound for burial, and many decades after outsiders first saw it, the cemetery finally began to be documented with the level of detail its strangeness deserved. Yet even after proper excavation, the graves did not become ordinary. If anything, better documentation made them stranger in a more disciplined way. Archaeologists could now say more clearly that the mound was built in layers, that the boat coffins followed repeated patterns, that some posts may have encoded symbolic distinctions, that cattle materials were central, and that the cemetery belonged to a wider Bronze Age tradition in the region. But explanation did not reduce the site to something dull. It simply changed the kind of questions one asked. Instead of saying, "What on earth is this?" scholars could begin asking, why boats in a desert oasis? Why these posts? Why this pattern of grave construction? Why do some burials vary? How local was this tradition? What does the material culture say about contact with surrounding worlds? Good archaeology often works like that. It does not remove mystery. It makes mystery more precise. There is a temptation, when faced with a cemetery like Xiaohe, to treat it as if it were designed to be read by us, like an ancient message with obvious symbols waiting patiently for a modern decoder ring. But burial grounds rarely work that way. They are social spaces first. The people making these graves were communicating with one another, with memory, with grief, perhaps with ancestors or cosmological ideas we cannot fully recover. We are only eavesdropping. That is why the simplest observations are often the safest and most revealing. The Xiaohe dead were buried individually in carefully prepared coffins. The graves were marked. The cemetery mound was reused over time. Cattle mattered. Orientation mattered. The environment preserved more than usual. Gumagu shows related customs in the same broad region. And together these facts tell us something very solid. The early communities of the Tarim Basin had developed a recognizable and highly structured funerary world of their own. Whatever outside influences may later be discussed, the graves themselves already show a local system, repeated often enough to become tradition. What the graves also did, perhaps unintentionally, was shape the first modern reactions to the mummies. Before DNA, before stable isotope studies, before broader syntheses of Bronze Age movement across Inner Asia, the graves gave people a visual and emotional framework for interpretation. A body in a boat coffin wrapped in wool, preserved with hair and clothing, lying beneath a marked post in the sand, is not a neutral piece of evidence. It encourages conclusions, it invites comparisons, it makes viewers start building stories immediately, sometimes too quickly. And that is exactly what happened. The burial setting was so distinctive and the dead so well preserved that the first impressions of who these people must have been began forming long before the genetic evidence complicated matters. The graves made the mummies visible, but they also made them easy to project onto. That, too, is part of their history. So when people speak of the Tarim Basin mummies as a mystery, it is worth remembering that the mystery did not begin in the lab. It began in the ground. It began with a cemetery on a sand mound, with boat-shaped coffins sealed in hides, with upright posts weathered by desert wind, with graves stacked in phases across centuries, and with bodies that survived long enough to confront the modern world face to face. Before anyone argued about ancestry, language, or migration, the graves had already said something difficult to ignore. These people belonged here strongly enough to bury their dead in a repeated, coherent local way. And yet when those graves were opened, the faces that emerged did not fit the simple story many expected at first glance, which is where the next part of this journey properly begins. What startled people next were the faces. Once the graves at sites like Xiaohe were opened, and the dead began to emerge from the sand with hair, clothing, skin, and facial contours still visible, the reaction was almost immediate. These were not the anonymous skeletons most people imagine when they think of deep prehistory. They looked like individuals. They looked recent in the unnerving way that naturally preserved bodies often do. And because the Tarim Basin mummies quickly became known outside specialist circles through photographs and museum displays, their faces began doing what faces always do in public life. They started telling stories, or at least inviting other people to tell stories about them. That would turn out to be both helpful and misleading. One of the first things worth saying carefully is that the Tarim Mummies is an umbrella label, not the name of one neatly bounded population from one moment in time. The famous naturally preserved bodies found around the Tarim Basin span a very long period, from roughly 2000 BCE to around 200 CE, and they come from multiple sites across the basin, rather than a single cemetery or community. The 2021 genome-wide study that changed the debate most sharply focused on 13 of the earliest known Tarim Basin individuals, dating to about 2100 to 1700 BCE, and associated with the Xiaohe horizon, but public fascination had been building long before that from many different finds. That matters because the moment people begin to lump all of those remains together into one simple image, the story starts to drift away from the evidence. Still, it is not hard to understand why first impressions were so powerful. As archaeologist Paula Dupuy put it in Nature's reporting on the discoveries, the mummies were often described as tall, fair-skinned, fair-haired, and long-nosed, with what earlier observers called a Western appearance. The Max Planck summary of the 2021 study says much the same, noting that the mummies drew international attention because of their so-called Western physical appearance, their felted and woven woolen clothing, and their agripastoral economy based on cattle, sheep, goat, wheat, barley, and millet. Those details formed a very persuasive package. People saw preserved hair, strong noses, wool textiles, and herding economies in the heart of Inner Asia, and immediately began looking west for explanations. That reaction tells us something important about how human beings read the past. We do not simply observe faces, we classify them. We compare them to modern populations, to familiar types, to categories we have inherited from older anthropology, older politics, and older habits of seeing. In the Tarim case, those habits were especially strong because earlier scholarship sometimes used labels like Caucasoid, Europoid, or Proto-Europoid for some of these remains, language that now feels dated not only scientifically but conceptually. The older terms were trying to sort ancient people into broad visual boxes before genome-wide ancient DNA was available, and the effect was to make the mummies seem like obvious outsiders even when the evidence was not nearly that simple. It's also worth noticing that the mummy's appearance did not act alone. The clothes spoke at the same time. Woolen garments, felt hats, leather goods, and other surviving organic materials gave the dead a kind of cultural outline before their genetics had even entered the conversation. Some of the things buried with them, and some of the animals and crops associated with their communities, seemed to fit broader Bronze Age patterns known from steppe herders or oasis societies to the west. By 2015, a mitochondrial DNA study of the Xiao Cemetery was already framing the debate in terms of two main explanations: a steppe hypothesis, connected to Afanasyevo and later Andronovo groups, and a Bactrian oasis hypothesis, linked to the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. That paper also emphasised how similarities in burial ritual, skeletal traits, wool textiles, wheat, sheep, and goats, and traces of ephedra had encouraged those competing origin stories. In other words, the faces were not read in isolation. They were read alongside a whole kit of suggestive objects and practices, and once a story like that begins to take shape, it gathers momentum very quickly. The idea that these striking desert mummies were migrants from far to the west had obvious appeal. It seemed to explain the appearance. It seemed to explain the wool and livestock. It seemed to connect the Tarim Basin to wider Bronze Age movement across Eurasia. Later, when scholars linked early Indo-European language dispersals to steppe populations such as the Afanasyevo, the temptation grew even stronger. Nature's coverage of the 2021 genomic work notes that many hypotheses about the Tarim mummies' origins centred on migration from the north or west, with particular attention paid to Afanasyevo connections, partly because Afanasyevo herders also practiced animal husbandry and were themselves associated with a Western Steppe ancestry. The mummies looked like they belonged to a familiar migration story, and so they were placed into one. Yet appearance, useful as it can be in some contexts, is not a reliable shortcut to ancestry at this scale. A face is not a passport, and a preserved hairstyle is not a migration map. That sounds obvious when said plainly, but it is exactly the sort of mistake people repeatedly make with ancient remains, especially when those remains are unusually well preserved and visually striking. The Tarim Basin mummies did not look like a neat extension of what many outside observers expected ancient Western China to look like, so they were turned into evidence for long-distance replacement. But biology does not work according to modern visual intuition, and neither does prehistory. Populations can preserve old ancestry for a long time. Communities can adopt clothing styles, crops, and livestock without being wholesale colonists from wherever those things first became common. Cultural borrowing can travel farther and faster than genes. In fact, even before the genome-wide study overturned the simplest migration ideas, the evidence was already less tidy than public retellings made it seem. Earlier genetic work on mitochondrial DNA from Xiaohe reported a broad spread of maternal lineages that the authors interpreted as linking the cemetery population to Western Eurasia, Eastern Siberia, and Southern or Western Asia. That result did not settle the question at all, but it did encourage the notion that the earliest Tarim communities were biologically mixed from the outset. Nature's later reporting on the genome-wide work pointed out that those earlier studies had relied on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome evidence, both of which offer much lower resolution than whole genome data. So even the science, before 2021, was feeding a picture of visible difference plus partial genetic diversity, which made the westward origin story feel even more plausible than it actually was. There is another layer to why the faces had such force. Archaeology usually asks us to imagine the human from fragments. A jaw, a pelvis, a pot, a cluster of seeds, somewhere on a tooth. Xiaohe and related sites offered something more direct. a naturally mummified woman from Xiaohe can still be described in excavation records as having a sharply preserved face. The 2015 Xiaohe study even includes a figure caption identifying a female mummy with European features, which gives you some idea of how readily visual shorthand entered the scientific literature itself. Once remains are described that way in papers, exhibitions, and media, the public does what the public always does. It takes a technical caution and turns it into a simple identity claim. She looked European, therefore she was European. The logic is appealing, fast, and often wrong. The problem becomes even more obvious when one remembers how much time is compressed into the image most people carry of the Tarim mummies. Some of the best-known bodies from the broader basin are centuries apart. Some belong to the early and middle Bronze Age cemetery world around Xiaohe and Gumugu. Others are later, from the first millennium BCE, when the Tarim Basin had already become more interconnected and population histories had become more layered. The Nature paper was very explicit that its dataset concerned the earliest yet discovered human remains from the Tarim Basin, and that those early individuals belonged to a distinct early Middle Bronze Age context. That means any sweeping statement of the form the Tarim mummies were X is immediately on shaky ground unless it specifies which mummies, from which site, and from which century. The faces looked like one mystery, but they actually belonged to several overlapping histories. What made the visual evidence especially persuasive, though, was that it seemed to match the geography people already imagined. The Tarim Basin sits at a crossroads in Inner Asia, and by the Bronze Age it was already a region where routes, oases and neighbouring cultural zones mattered. The Max Planck summary describes Xinjiang as a major intersection of Eastern and Western cultures, agriculture, languages, and peoples. If you already believe a place is a crossroads, and then you uncover ancient bodies with preserved wool, livestock economies, and faces that remind you of populations farther west, you're almost guaranteed to see movement before you see continuity. The basin's reputation as a meeting point primed scholars and the public alike to read the mummies as arrivals. It took better genetic tools to show that a crossroads is not the same thing as a one-way entrance hall. When the genomic evidence finally came, that is precisely the assumption it challenged. The 2021 Nature paper found that the earliest Tarim individuals did not support the leading hypotheses that had tied them to Afanasyevo pastoralists, BMAC oasis populations, or other expected source groups. Instead, the paper concluded that the earliest Tarim Basin cultures arose from a genetically isolated local population that had adopted neighbouring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices. The Max Planck summary put it even more bluntly. The Tarim Basin mummies were not newcomers to the region at all, but descendants of an older population related to Ancient North Eurasians, a lineage that had been widespread in the Pleistocene and later became rare. Their faces had encouraged people to look for recent Western migrants. Their genomes pointed towards something much older and much stranger. That does not mean the faces were irrelevant. It means they had to be interpreted differently. The Western look that drew so much notice was real as a visual impression, but it did not mean what many expected it to mean. Nature's coverage of the study emphasises that the leading migration hypotheses failed not because the mummies looked less Western than people had thought, but because those visible traits were not evidence of direct descent from the specific Bronze Age populations scholars had proposed. The genomes showed zero detectable Afanasyevo contribution in the studied Tarim individuals, despite the fact that Afanasyevo ancestry was present in contemporaneous or earlier populations to the north in the Dzungarian Basin. That is a useful reminder that resemblance is not the same as identity. People can appear to fit a familiar map while actually belonging to a very different branch of human history. It is also worth slowing down over just how unusual that result was. The Tarim Basin was not sealed off from the world. The same Nature study and its accompanying report stressed that the early Tarim communities were genetically isolated, but not culturally isolated. They practiced dairying. They grew or consumed crops with origins both to the west and the east. They knew about animals, plants and techniques that had circulated across neighbouring regions. So when the faces seemed to say foreign, and the material culture seemed to say connected, many people assumed genes would say the same. But genes did not cooperate. The early Tarim population appears to have maintained a strong local biological continuity while still participating in broader cultural exchange. That is one of the most interesting things about them. They looked like a case of migration, and turned out to be a case of selective adoption in a difficult environment. There is, if we are honest, something slightly humbling about that. We are very fond of reading history from faces because faces feel direct. They seem less ambiguous than pots or seeds or isotopes. We trust them because we are built to trust them. But ancient faces arrive stripped of their original social meanings. We do not know how their own communities understood beauty, resemblance, kinship, age, status, or familiarity. We only know how they strike us. In the Tarim Basin, that gap between how they looked to us and who they actually were became unusually large. The preserved dead seemed to belong to a ready-made story of west to east migration, and so for decades that was the story many people preferred. It took a combination of archaeology, proteomics, and genome-wide DNA to say, gently but firmly, not quite. The irony is that the real story is better. If the mummies had turned out to be exactly what the first glance suggested, they would still have been interesting, but they would have been far less revealing. What makes them such an important case is that they force us to separate three things we are always tempted to blend together: biological ancestry, cultural practice, and visual impression. The Tarim people could wear wool, herd cattle and sheep, use wheat and millet, bury their dead in boat coffins, and still not be straightforward migrants from the West. They could look, to modern eyes, unlike the population history many viewers expected for ancient Western China, and still be deeply rooted in the region as an early local population. Once you understand that, the faces stop being the answer and become the beginning of a better question. And that better question is not really about appearance at all, it is about place. If these people were not recent arrivals in the simple sense, how did a genetically distinctive community establish itself and endure in a basin that was dry, shifting, and difficult? How did they live at the edge of desert and oasis? What sort of world made boat coffins, cattle hides, wool, dairy and riverine settlement part of the same social fabric? Once the first shock of the faces passed, the next task was to look outward from the body to the landscape, because the Tarim Basin itself had been shaping the story all along. To make sense of why the Tarim mummies seem so unexpected, it helps to stop looking at their faces for a moment and look instead at the place that held them. The Tarim Basin is not a minor corner of the map. It is a vast depression in what is now Xinjiang in western China, covering roughly 906,500 square kilometres and enclosed by the Tian Shan to the north, the Pamirs to the west, the Kunlun Mountains to the south, and the Altun Mountains to the east. In the middle sits the Taklamakan Desert, one of the largest sandy deserts on Earth. The geography matters immediately, because this is not a landscape you drift into by accident and then carry on with your week. It is a basin walled by high country, dominated by sand, and cut off from reliable moisture by the surrounding mountains, which block humid air masses from reaching the interior. That dryness is not a dramatic flourish, added by later writers. It is the central fact of the region. Britannica describes the Tarim Basin as the driest region of Eurasia, with annual rainfall in much of the basin under 100 millimetres and in parts of the Taklamakan and Lop Nur Basin around 12 millimetres on average. NASA's Earth Observatory goes even further for the central basin, noting that some interior areas receive less than 10 millimetres of precipitation per year. At the same time, evaporation is extreme. A scientific report study on prehistoric agriculture in the Tarim notes that the Taklamakan receives almost no rainfall, while evaporation can reach about 3,000 millimetres per year. So when people say the Tarim Basin lay at the edge of the world, They're not only talking about distance from imperial centres or famous capitals, they're also talking about the basic fact that most of this basin is very hard on water, and anything hard on water is hard on people, and yet it was never simply empty. That is one of the first corrections a landscape demands. The basin is harsh, but it is not uniformly dead. What makes life possible there are the mountain-fed rivers. Snow and glacier melt from the Tian Shan, and Kunlun descend into the basin and create narrow corridors of water and vegetation along the desert margins. NASA describes runoff from those mountains feeding rivers that in turn support vegetation around the rim, while Britannica notes that the Tarim River system is formed by the confluence of western tributaries such as the Kashgar and Yarkand, and is later joined by rivers like the Aksu and Hotan. Much of that water is seasonal, and some rivers disappear into sand or migrate across unstable channels. But where they survive, they create strips of green that have always mattered far more than their width on a map suggests. That is why later descriptions of the Tarim often emphasize oases rather than the basin as a whole. The central desert dominates the eye, but people lived on the margins. The 2020 Scientific Reports paper on Wupper describes the Tarim landscape as one that gave birth to the beaded oases that later characterized the Silk Road. Those oases were supported by irrigated cereal farming adapted to local conditions, and in historical periods they became hubs linking major regions of Asia. Long before the famous Silk Road city-states of the first millennium BCE and later centuries, the physical logic was already there. If you wanted to live in the Tarim Basin, you did not conquer the middle. You learned the edges. You settled where mountain water could be captured, shared, directed, and, if possible, persuaded not to vanish before the harvest. From a distance, especially from the perspective of large agrarian states farther east or southwest, the Tarim Basin can look like a frontier, a remote and difficult zone between more familiar worlds. That is the sense in which edge of the world is useful. But from inside the basin, the picture is different. It was not the end of anything. It was a chain of habitable pockets connected by rivers, marshes, deltas, alluvial fans, foothills, and narrow travel corridors between mountains and sand. Later, historical routes around the northern and southern margins of the Taklamakan followed that logic so closely that by the Western Han period, two major arteries of what we now call the Silk Road ran around the desert and joined at Kashgar before crossing the Pamirs into Central Asia. The road system became famous later, but the environmental rule behind it was older. Movement in the Tarim followed water. This is also why the Tarim Basin can be misleading to anyone reading it too quickly. A satellite view shows enormous emptiness. Human settlement, however, depends on very specific pieces of ground. NASA notes that sand dunes cover about 85% of the Taklamakan. Britannica gives the desert sandy area as more than 320,000 square kilometres. That sounds and is immense. But along the edges of those sands, vegetation can thicken quickly where runoff gathers, and the Tarim River itself links multiple green areas along the basin's northern side. In summer, NASA observed deciduous forests with poplar trees flourishing near the river, helping stabilise sandy soil. So the basin is not best imagined as a solid block of lifelessness with a few accidental villages. It is better understood as a sharply uneven environment where productive life concentrates in narrow zones, while the surrounding desert remains very good at reminding everyone who is in charge. For the early Bronze Age communities associated with the Tarim mummies, this mattered even more because their settlements and cemeteries were tied to hydrological conditions that were not fixed forever. Environmental work at Xiaohe shows that the people buried there did not live in the same fully desiccated setting the modern eye sees today. A 2013 PLOS-1 study based on pollen and plant remains concluded that the Xiaohui people lived in a well-developed oasis surrounded by extensive desert. The oasis vegetation included poplar, reeds, cattail and probably grasses, while the surrounding desert supported drought-resistant plants such as ephedra, tamarisk, artemisia, and ctenopods. The authors argued that there was enough water in the small river at that time to sustain that habitat. In other words, Xiaohe makes no sense if imagined as a cemetery dropped into a totally dead landscape. It belonged to an oasis world that later shrank or changed. That finding is one of the most useful correctives in the whole Tarim story. The cemetery looks dramatic because today it stands in desert, but the people who used it were not living a purely desert existence in the modern cinematic sense, all dunes and fatalism and an urgent relationship with wind. They were living in an oasis environment, one that included marsh or riverine plants, access to grazing, and at least some cereal cultivation. The same PLOS study notes preserved broomcorn millet, wheat, and even dried millet porridge in the graves, alongside evidence that animal husbandry was important. Those details pull the landscape back into focus. These were not random survivors at the edge of nowhere. They were members of small oasis communities managing mixed subsistence in a place where water shaped every practical decision. Archaeologists working more broadly in the Tarim Basin have reached similar conclusions. The Wupper study states that small groups of agricultural or semi-agricultural people were already concentrated in oases by as early as 2000 BCE. After about 500 BCE, some of those geographically confined populations expanded into more prosperous city-states, but the older pattern was already established much earlier. Human communities in the basin were clustered where water allowed it, not spread evenly across the landscape. That is an important distinction because it changes how we think about early movement and contact. These were not wandering populations drifting through a blank desert. They were communities anchored to specific ecological niches, often small and vulnerable, but not rootless. The rivers themselves encourage both settlement and uncertainty. Britannica notes that one characteristic of Tarim Basin rivers, including the Tarim itself, is active migration, meaning the shifting of their beds and banks. A considerable part of the Tarim's course historically followed no clearly defined channel and changed over time. This sounds like a dry technical detail, but for anyone depending on river water, it is the opposite of dry except in the catastrophic sense. A shifting channel means changing access, changing reeds, changing pasture, changing transport, and perhaps eventually changing burial landscapes too. The basin's people were living with an environment that supplied life in narrow strips, while also rearranging the terms under which that life could continue. It is difficult to build complacency in a place like that. There is a tendency, especially in stories told from the outside, to imagine harsh landscapes as preserving only the toughest and simplest forms of life. The Tarim Basin does not fit that stereotype very well. It demanded adaptation, certainly, but adaptation can be sophisticated. By the later 2nd millennium and 1st millennium BCE, oasis communities in the basin had intensified farming, expanded irrigation, and become important nodes in regional exchange. The Wupper study argues that early farming in the southwestern basin used a mixed wheat and barley system, and that after 1200 BCE agriculture intensified through more elaborate irrigation and new crops, probably spreading in through mountain routes from southern Central Asia. Even if Xiaohe belongs to an earlier and somewhat different setting, the broader point stands. The Tarim's edges were not culturally simple. They rewarded careful water management, crop choice, and local knowledge. This is part of why the basin repeatedly confuses outsiders. To someone glancing at the map, the central fact is isolation. To someone studying its archaeology, the central fact is selective connection. The mountains limited movement, yes, but they also created channels. The rivers did not erase distance, but they organized it. The desert was a barrier, but its margins became roots. The Tarim Basin was therefore both isolated and linked, which is exactly the kind of combination that produces unusual cultural histories. A community could remain biologically distinctive for a long time, and still adopt crops, technologies, and ideas from neighbouring regions. That is precisely the pattern later genomic work suggested for the early Tarim mummies: genetic isolation alongside cultural openness. The landscape makes that result feel much less paradoxical. It also helps explain why a cemetery like Xiaohe could be both highly local and visually surprising. In a basin organised by water margins and ecological pockets, communities had strong reasons to develop their own burial traditions, their own relationships to place, and their own ways of marking continuity. At the same time, those same communities were not sealed in glass. They could encounter new grains, herding practices, materials, and perhaps ritual ideas coming through adjoining zones. The archaeological evidence from Xiaohe already hinted at such a mix. Local funerary traditions combined with crops and livestock that belonged to wider Eurasian histories. The basin did not force people into purity. It forced them into practicality. If something useful arrived and could survive the local conditions, there was every reason to adopt it without surrendering everything else. That practical streak shows up even in the choice of where to bury the dead. The Xiaohe cemetery stood about 4 kilometres from the small river, on a mound that formed a clear landmark on the flat desert. The PLOS study notes that its hillock shape made it a well-defined marker in the landscape. That is not a trivial feature in a basin where visibility, direction and seasonal access matter. A cemetery in such a place is not only a resting ground, it is also a point of return, a coordinate in memory, a fixed place in a shifting environment. In a world where rivers could alter their course and the difference between green land and sterile sand could be alarmingly narrow, fixed landmarks would have mattered greatly. The dead, in that sense, may have helped hold the living in place. There's another reason the basin matters so much to the Tarim mummy story. The same aridity that made daily life precarious also made archaeological survival possible. Britannica describes the climate as extremely dry. NASA emphasises how little precipitation the central basin receives. The PLOS work explains that the many well-preserved mummies of Xinjiang owe their condition to desert dryness and desiccation of the corpses. So the basin did not merely shape the lives of these people, it also shaped the way they entered modern science. In a wetter region, many of the details that made the mummies famous would simply not exist. The faces would have collapsed into bone, the wool would have rotted. The baskets, hides, and reeds would have disappeared. Their strangeness to us is therefore partly an accident of preservation. The basin kept records that other landscapes would have erased. That can make the Tarim Basin feel almost theatrical, as though it were designed to produce mysteries. It was not, of course. It was designed, if one insists on that sort of language, to make life difficult and evidence oddly durable. But the effect is similar. A harsh, enclosed depression ringed by mountains. One of the world's largest sandy deserts in the middle. Oases strung around the edges, rivers that appear, migrate, and disappear. Cemeteries rising as landmarks from flat ground. And then, thousands of years later, bodies emerging with features still visible enough to trigger debates about migration, identity, and ancestry. One could hardly ask for a more efficient machine for producing confident theories, and then embarrassing them. The basin has been doing that for quite some time. If we keep the landscape in mind, the phrase edge of the world starts to take on a more useful meaning. It was an edge not because nothing happened there, but because everything depended on narrow margins. Water margins, climate margins, travel margins, agricultural margins, and sometimes survival margins. The people of the early Tarim Basin were not living beyond history. They were living in a place where history had to be made with unusual care. They had to learn which river corridors could be trusted, which plants signalled reliable moisture, which seasons opened routes through mountain foothills, and which burial grounds would remain visible in the future. Harsh environments do not eliminate culture, they make culture concrete. And once you see the basin that way, some of the details at Xiaohe stop looking decorative and start looking local. Boat-shaped coffins in a cemetery associated with a well-developed oasis no longer feel like a surreal flourish in the desert. Reeds, cattle hides, and wooden structures begin to look like materials drawn from a riverine and pastoral world. The preserved grains in the graves fit an oasis economy rather than some purely nomadic fantasy. Even the visual shock of the mummies becomes easier to place. They were not simply desert curiosities. They were people formed by a marginal but viable ecological corridor, one that allowed them to live in the basin without ever pretending the basin was easy. So, before we move on to what they wore, what they ate, and what the objects in their graves suggest about daily life, it is worth holding this setting in the mind a little longer. Not an empty desert, but a basin ringed by mountains and fed by meltwater. Not limitless land, but habitable edges. Not isolation in the absolute sense, but selective contact shaped by roots around sand and along rivers. This is the world that produced the Tarim mummies. And once that world comes into view, the next questions become more grounded and more interesting, because now we can ask not just who these people were in the abstract, but how a community in such a place actually lived from one season to the next. For all the drama of the cemetery, the people of Xiaohe were not spending their days staging mysteries for future archaeologists. They were living in an oasis economy at the edge of a desert, and almost everything found in the graves suggests a life built out of practical skills, animal husbandry, careful use of plants, and a very clear understanding of which materials mattered most in a difficult landscape. That is one of the most useful ways to approach them. Instead of beginning with the question of who they really were in some grand historical sense, it is often better to begin with the ordinary. What did they wear? What did they eat? What did they make with their hands? What animals did they depend on? What tools did they carry? Once you start there, the Xiaohe world becomes less like a puzzle box and more like a community. And communities, even very strange-looking ones in the archaeological record, are always built out of routines before they are built out of theories. The burial evidence is unusually rich because the dry desert preserved organic remains so well, and that preservation allows a much more intimate view of daily life than Bronze Age archaeology usually gets. Textiles, leather, baskets, food residues, plant remains, wooden implements, and even traces of dairy protein survived closely enough to reconstruct not just ritual, but habit. One of the first things that becomes clear is that clothing mattered, and not in a decorative way alone. The dead at Xiaohe were often dressed according to a recognisable pattern. A detailed review of the cemetery describes felt headgear, leather boots, wrapping mantles, bracelets on the right wrist, and narrow woolen garments as common features in the burials, with many graves still preserving textiles or textile remnants. The same work notes that objects made from domestic animals included leather boots, leather bags, felt headgear, mantles, loincloths, woolen yarns, and fur pillows, which tells us immediately that woolworking, leatherworking, sewing, and animal processing were not occasional skills. They were essential. Even if we knew nothing else about the people, those items alone would tell us that herding and textile production were central to life. A community does not bury its dead so consistently in felt, wool, and leather unless those materials were familiar, abundant enough to use, and culturally important. The famous beauty of Xiaohe makes that general picture easier to visualize because she is one of the best preserved examples. The Penn Museum notes that she was found wrapped in a wide woolen cloak, and more general accounts of Xiaohe clothing emphasize felt hats, woolen garments, and leather footwear as typical rather than exceptional. It is tempting to focus on the visual strangeness of the outfit because photographs of these mummies make that almost unavoidable. But the more interesting point is practical. None of this clothing is accidental. Felt is warm, durable, and well suited to dry, cold, windy conditions. Wool is versatile, insulates well, and fits a pastoral economy. Leather boots are exactly what one would expect in a region where temperature swings, rough ground, and long movement across sand or scrub would punish anything flimsy. The clothing looks distinctive to us partly because it survived, but in their own lives it was probably what sensible people wore in a place that did not reward fashion over function. The textiles also hint at a considerable level of technical competence. To produce woolen clothing at scale, a community needs sheep or goats, systems for managing them, routines for shearing or processing fibre, techniques for spinning yarn, and some method of weaving, felting or binding cloth into usable forms. The cemetery evidence shows woolen yarns, felt headgear, mantles, and other garments repeatedly enough that this was not casual household improvisation. It suggests stable knowledge passed through generations. Someone had to know how to clean fleece, how to twist it into thread, how to work it into cloth, and how to cut or assemble garments appropriate for men, women, and children. Burial clothing can sometimes exaggerate formality, but even then it reflects the skills available to the living. The people of Xiaohe were not simply borrowing finished textiles from somewhere else and calling it a day. They were part of a textile world. That same burial evidence suggests dress may also have expressed social roles or categories, though here caution is useful. The Xiaohe study notes that certain objects such as arrows and bows appeared consistently in male graves, while combs, wooden phallic objects, and leather bags appeared more often in female graves. But burial pattern is not the same thing as a census form. What it shows reliably is that mourners made repeated choices about how to equip the dead. Some of those choices likely reflected roles recognised in life. Men may have been more directly associated with hunting, for example, because arrows, arrow shafts, and bows were regularly included with male burials, even with at least one small boy. That strongly suggests these items were not just tools but markers of a social identity learned early. Still, we should resist the urge to turn every grave good into a perfect biography. Burial language is symbolic as well as practical. A bow in the grave may mean hunter, adult male, protector, lineage member, or something more layered than any one modern label can capture. Even so, hunting clearly mattered. The same cemetery review notes the presence of wild animals in or around the graves, including vulture, weasel, badger, lizard, and snake remains, and argues that hunting probably supplemented the community's economy alongside livestock keeping and agriculture. That fits the oasis setting well. A small Bronze Age community living along a river margin in the Tarim Basin would have had every reason to diversify. Herding alone can be risky in marginal environments. Farming alone is riskier still when water is uncertain. Hunting, trapping, collecting, and making use of wild animals would have added flexibility, food, hides, and perhaps symbolic materials. The graves do not allow us to reconstruct daily menus in detail, but they do suggest a community that made use of both domestic and wild resources, which is exactly what one would expect from people living in a narrow ecological corridor with little room for waste. Food evidence from Xiaohe is especially revealing because it is unusually specific. According to the same detailed archaeological review, some grass baskets found in the graves contained cooked and uncooked foods, including millet porridge and grains of wheat and millet. That is already enough to say something important. These people were not only herders, they were also using cereals, and not in a token way. A few lines later, the same source states that millet was cooked with milk as a porridge. That small detail is wonderfully useful because it pulls daily life into focus. Suddenly this is not just Bronze Age subsistence, it is breakfast, or dinner, or burial food modelled on ordinary meals. Either way, it implies cooking practices, storage practices, and a mixed food economy in which grain and dairy were combined in ways that would have been familiar to the living. That pattern is reinforced by the genomic and proteomic work. The 2021 Nature study on the earliest Tarim Basin individuals found strong evidence of milk proteins in dental calculus from Xiaohe, showing that dairy pastoralism was already important at the site from its earliest phase. That is an unusually direct line from biology to daily routine. Dental calculus is not interested in romance, it records what passes through the mouth. If milk proteins are turning up there repeatedly, then dairy was not a ceremonial curiosity, it was part of life. And when that evidence is set next to the grave baskets containing porridge, grain, and dairy residues, the picture becomes more concrete still. These people were herding animals not just for hides and prestige, but for milk and the products milk can become when a community knows how to handle it. There is even stronger support for that in the residues found in one of the grass-woven baskets from Xiaohe. A 2016 study identified the organic deposit in such a basket as strained sour milk, and another report summarised the cemetery's dairy finds as solid kefir cheeses from burials in the first and second layers of Xiaohe, calling them the earliest and only material evidence of such solid cheese from that period. One should always be a little careful with world's oldest style language, because science enjoys updating those claims at inconvenient moments, but the basic point is secure enough. The Xiaohe people were not merely drinking fresh milk, they were fermenting and processing it. That is a very different level of food knowledge. Fermented dairy keeps longer, travels better, and extracts more value from pastoral animals. It also implies repeated traditions of handling microbes, timing, containers and texture, all without anyone writing down a recipe on a handy kitchen wall. Once that is in view, cattle begin to stand out even more strongly. A recent synthesis of Xiaohe funerary symbolism states that these Bronze Age populations cultivated wheat and millet, herded cattle, and that cattle played a central role in their lives, evidenced by cattle hides used to cover coffins, painted bovine skulls in burials, and cattle hearts and ears included among grave goods. That is a striking list. It tells us cattle were not simply one domestic species among many. They were everywhere in the funerary record because they were everywhere in the social and economic imagination. Hides covered the dead, skulls entered the grave, body parts became offerings or symbolic objects. If the Xiao people leaned heavily on dairy pastoralism, cattle would already have mattered for milk, traction if used, meat, hide, dung, and status. The burial evidence suggests that material dependence had also acquired ritual weight. The cosmetic sticks from Xiaohe provide one of the oddest and most vivid examples of that cattle connection. A 2016 scientific report study concluded that these red cosmetic sticks were made from cattle heart and coated with hematite pigment. That sounds almost too strange to be real, but it gives an extraordinary glimpse into how animal resources could move beyond food and clothing into bodily decoration and ceremony. Whether these sticks were everyday cosmetic tools, ritual items, or both, they show that the people of Xiaohe did not draw the same neat line modern industrial societies often do between practical animal use and symbolic use. The same species could feed you, clothe you, seal a coffin, mark the grave, and produce the material used to paint faces red. In a small pastoral society, that kind of overlap is not bizarre at all. It is efficient, intimate, and culturally dense. And then there are the boats, or at least the boat-shaped coffins. It is one of the most discussed features of Xiaohe, and for obvious reasons. Boat coffins in an oasis society on the edge of a great desert sound like symbolism, trying very hard to get our attention. The most recent major interpretation, published in 2025, argues that the Xiaohe culture was a riverine oasis culture deeply shaped by water, and that the inverted boat coffins, along with grave markers resembling paddles and mooring posts, should be read within that context. The argument is not that these people were naval enthusiasts tragically stranded in the sand. It is that in a landscape where seasonal meltwater, channels, reeds, marshes and oases made life possible, water may have sat close to the centre of their worldview. In such a context, burying the dead in upturned boats with paddle-like or post-like markers would connect death to a familiar and vital resource, rather than to some imported symbol randomly dropped into the desert. That interpretation is persuasive partly because it solves a practical puzzle without being overly tidy. Earlier readers often treated the boats as something exotic that demanded distant parallels, but a community living along waterways and oasis margins would know exactly what boats, paddles, moorings, and water crossings meant. The 2025 study specifically notes that the broad-ended poles are likely paddles in symbolic form, and that the prevalence of water-themed burial elements suggests the deceased were being connected to the water sources that sustain the community. That does not prove a single fixed doctrine about the afterlife. Archaeologists are right to be careful there, but it does make daily life and funerary life feel less disconnected. The people who rode or saw boats in life may have continued to think with boats in death. In a place where survival depended on water, but where water was never guaranteed, that would make an uncomfortable amount of sense. What this suggests, taken together, is that daily life at Xiaoyi sat at the meeting point of herding, small-scale farming, food processing, textile making, and riverine or marsh edge adaptation. The community relied on domestic cattle and sheep or goats, but also used cereals such as wheat and millet. They made baskets from grass or reeds. They processed dairy into portable forms. They made and wore felted and woven clothing suited to a harsh climate. They hunted enough to leave traces of bows, arrows, and wild animals in the archaeological record. They worked wood carefully enough to produce standardized coffins, posts, bowls, and other objects. They used animal sinew, leather, hide, wool, and probably dung, each for different purposes. None of that sounds glamorous, but it is exactly how real communities endure in marginal places. They do many things competently instead of one thing dramatically. There is also a social side to all of this that should not be missed. Burial clothing and grave goods suggest that people were not simply individuals with possessions. They were members of a group with shared expectations about proper appearance, proper burial, and proper equipment. Bracelets on the right wrist, headgear, boots, and wrapping mantles appear repeatedly enough to look like a burial code, perhaps reflecting normal dress in some respects, and ceremonial dress in others. Some graves contained richer sets of goods, including feathers, valuable stones, bronze pieces, or decorated wooden objects, which may point to differences in status or role. But even the simpler graves still speak the same material language. This was a community that knew how a body should be dressed, how a meal should be represented, how grain should be placed, and what kinds of objects belonged with the dead. That social consistency implies a stable living tradition behind the cemetery. People had learned these customs somewhere, probably at home, over many ordinary years. At the same time, the evidence keeps reminding us how much we do not know. Houses have not survived at Xiaohe in the way one might wish, so daily life must be inferred indirectly from graves, residues, and environmental studies. That means we can see the products of work much more clearly than the exact spaces where the work happened. We know there were grass baskets, but not the conversation around the hands weaving them. We know millet was cooked with milk, but not whether it was considered comfort food, festive food, travel food, or simply what happened to be on offer most days. We know felt hats and leather boots were common, but not whether children complained about putting them on. Archaeology gives us the structure of life more readily than its tone. Still, at Xiaohe the structure is unusually rich. We can see a people who are busy with animals, cloth, hides, grains, reeds, pigment, wood, and the management of resources that had to be converted carefully from seasonal opportunity into long-term survival. That is perhaps why the cemetery feels so alive despite being a burial ground. The objects are not abstract symbols invented solely for death. They come straight out of daily routines. The wool cloak belonged to a textile economy. The boots belonged to walking ground that required them. The porridge belonged to cooking and grain storage. The dairy residue belonged to herding and fermentation. The cattle hides belonged to slaughter, processing, and reuse. The arrows belonged to hunting, training, and perhaps defence. Even the boat coffins, if the water-based interpretation is right, belong to a living community that understood waterways not as metaphors first, but as necessities. In other words, the graves beneath the sand preserved daily life, because daily life itself was placed into the graves. The two were never sharply separate to begin with, and that is exactly what makes the next question more interesting. If a community could weave wool, herd cattle, ferment dairy, cook grain porridge, hunt wild animals, and bury its dead with such extraordinary organic detail still intact, then the desert was doing more than simply surrounding them. It was shaping what survived, what disappeared, and how these people would later be rediscovered. Their daily life was made of fragile things: cloth, hide, milk residue, reeds, skin, hair, wood. The sort of things archaeology usually loses first. In the Tarim Basin, many of those fragile things remained, which means the story of how the desert preserved the ancient dead is also the story of how it preserved the texture of their lives. What made the Tarim dead so memorable was not simply that they were old. Archaeology is full of old dead people. That, if anything, is one of the field's more predictable features. What made these burials different was that the desert had not reduced them to the familiar minimum of bone and dust. It had held on to the softer, more human parts. Hair survived, skin survived, felt, wool, leather, baskets, wooden coffins, reeds, twigs, grain, and traces of food survived. At Xiaohe in particular, researchers have repeatedly described the preservation as exceptional, with the site's organic remains surviving largely because it sat in a hyper-arid environment and because the human remains lay in dry, sandy, well-drained soil that was also alkaline and high in salt. Those are the sort of details that sound dull until one remembers that they are the reason a 3,000 or 4,000-year-old face can still startle a modern viewer. The simplest explanation is still the most important one. Bodies decompose quickly when moisture, microbes, insects and time all get to work together in favourable conditions. The Tarim Basin was generous with time, certainly, but far less generous with moisture. The wider region around Xiaohe was very dry, and the cemetery itself lay in sandy ground where water drained away rather than lingering. That matters because a body that dries out fast has a much better chance of becoming naturally mummified. Instead of remaining damp enough for ordinary putrefaction to proceed easily, the tissues lose water, shrink and harden. Decay does not stop entirely, but it changes character. The desert, in other words, did not embalm these people in the way ancient Egyptians did. It simply removed one of decay's favourite working conditions. But dryness alone does not tell the whole story, because lots of deserts are dry without producing cemeteries that preserve this much detail. Xiaohe seems to have combined several helpful conditions at once. The soil is described in the genetic study of the site as dry, sandy, well-drained, alkaline, and high in salt. Each of those features pushes in roughly the same direction. Sand lets water move away. Dryness limits rot. High salt content can make preservation easier by drawing out moisture and creating an environment less favourable to many decomposers. Alkalinity affects how materials break down in the ground and can preserve some organic and skeletal elements better than more acidic conditions would. None of this turned the cemetery into a laboratory freezer, of course, but together these conditions created a place where a body had a fighting chance of staying recognisable far longer than usual. There is something almost unfair about that, really. In most places, the humble business of ordinary chemistry gets the last word quickly enough. A few centuries pass, perhaps less, and what remains is fragmentary. At Xiaohe, the dead encountered a landscape that was unusually stingy about giving decomposition what it needed. The result is why the mummies look so immediate. It was not because time had spared them out of sentiment. It was because climate, soil and burial setting formed a taphonomic alliance, which is the archaeological way of saying that several small physical advantages lined up and behaved with remarkable efficiency. The dead did not conquer decay. The environment simply made decay work under much worse management. The cemetery's own construction helped as well. Xiaohe burials were placed in boat-shaped wooden coffins without bottoms, covered by wooden lids and then by cattle hides. Detailed grave descriptions from the site show the containers built from side planks and short lid boards, with 3 large pieces of ox hide laid over the top and tamarisk twigs above them. That combination of wood, hide and sand matters, because it means the body was not thrown directly into open ground and left to negotiate with the desert on its own. It was enclosed, protected and partially buffered. Even if the coffin was not airtight in the modern sense, it still created a small burial chamber that could slow disturbance from blowing sand, limit direct exposure, and help the body dry in a more controlled way. The graves, in other words, did not just place the dead in an arid landscape. They packaged them within it. That packaging is worth lingering over because it helps explain why so much more than bodies survived. A human body dries out quickly enough in the right desert conditions, but textiles and plant fibres are fragile too. So are leather, felt, wool, hair, wooden combs, baskets, and the little twigs and stems archaeologists are usually delighted to find if they survive in even poor condition. At Xiaohe, many of those materials endured, which suggests the graves were doing more than allowing desiccation. They were protecting a whole miniature environment of organic objects from the worst of weather, movement, and biological attack. The wooden structure kept shape. The hides formed a cover. The sand buried the whole arrangement and reduced surface disturbance. The result was not perfect preservation in every case, but it was enough to let archaeology recover an amount of intimate evidence that feels almost unfair compared with most Bronze Age sites. The wider environmental setting also contributed in a slightly more roundabout way. The people of Xiaohe did not live in an absolutely dead desert. Environmental analysis shows they inhabited a well-developed oasis surrounded by extensive desert, with poplar, reeds, cattails, and other vegetation in the wetter zone while drought-resistant plants dominated outside it. There was enough water in the small river at the time to support wetland and oasis life, and the rich alluvial soils of flooded areas could sustain crops and livestock. That may sound, at first, like bad news for preservation. More water usually means more decay. But the key point is that the cemetery sat within a sharply uneven landscape. The living used the watered margins. The dead were placed in a sandy burial ground within a broader hyper-arid region. The same environment that made oasis life possible also made it possible to bury people in dry ground close enough to community life to remain meaningful, yet dry enough to preserve them unnervingly well. That contrast is one of the cleverer things about the setting. A cemetery too far into the wetland would risk poorer preservation. A cemetery too far into truly inaccessible desert might be difficult to revisit or maintain. Xiaohe appears to have occupied a useful middle position, close to a riverine oasis world, but on a raised sandy mound that functioned as a stable burial landmark. Earlier work on the site notes the mound-like form of the cemetery and emphasises that the local environment, while dry in a regional sense, still had sufficient hydrological support along the river for the community to survive. That meant the mourners did not have to choose between practicality and memory. They could bury their dead in a place both preservative and recognisable. The dead remained in the community's landscape, not far outside it. Seasonality likely played its part too, even if the core mechanism remained desiccation. Hyper-arid deserts often combine sharp temperature swings with very low humidity, and general summaries of Tarim mummy preservation repeatedly note the role of dry climate together with saline soils and extreme temperature variation. One does not need to lean too heavily on any single season to see the broader pattern. When a body is placed in an environment that is very dry, often windy, and prone to strong temperature contrasts, soft tissue can lose moisture rapidly enough to outrun ordinary decomposition. The desert does not preserve by kindness. It preserves by being inhospitable to almost everything equally. That includes the microbes that would otherwise have made much shorter work of the dead. This is also why the Tarim mummies can look so different from artificially embalmed mummies in people's imagination. There is no thick layer of resin, no linen architecture designed by embalmers, no carefully removed organs prepared for canopic companionship. Natural mummification is much less theatrical in its method, though not in its result. The body simply dries where it lies. Skin tightens, features hold, hair remains attached, clothing stays in place if the burial is not disturbed. In a place like Xiaohe, where the bodies were carefully laid out, covered, and then left in soil not inclined toward rapid decay, the effect could be extraordinary. The dead begin to look less like archaeological remains and more like paused people, which is exactly why photographs of them can unsettle even viewers who are otherwise quite relaxed about old skeletons. It is worth stressing that this preservation was not uniform or magical. Some bodies decayed more than others. Some graves were disturbed by robbers or erosion. Some faces remained far more legible than others. Some soft tissue was lost while hair or clothing endured. Archaeology rarely grants total consistency, and Xiaohe is no exception. But the overall pattern is strong enough that scholars routinely describe the site as one of exceptional organic preservation. The reason that phrase matters is that organic preservation includes far more than bodies. It means the cemetery preserved a world of perishable things: reeds placed in graves, woolen yarn, leather bags, wooden combs, felt caps, food residues, dairy traces, and all the other ordinary materials that usually vanish first. A wet cemetery might still preserve bones. A cemetery like Xiaohe preserved habits. And habits are exactly what make the site feel so close. Because once cloth survives, a body still has clothing rather than merely evidence of clothing. Once a basket survives, a grave still holds a container rather than just stains in the soil where one used to be. Once food residues survive, the distance between ritual and supper gets much shorter. The dry cemetery at Xiaohe therefore did something archaeology almost never gets to enjoy at this scale. It preserved not only the physical person, but also the texture of the person's material world. This is why the mummies do not merely tell us that Bronze Age people lived in the Tarim Basin. They tell us how they dressed, what they carried, what they covered coffins with, what plants they used, and what kinds of food and dairy processing were part of life. Preservation made the dead articulate. There is another subtle factor here, which is burial depth and sealing. Some of the best-known Tarim mummies from the broader basin were buried shallowly in sandy ground, and at Xiaohe the grave architecture itself suggests concern with enclosing and marking the dead. Wooden lids, oxhide coverings, and the surrounding sand together would have reduced direct access by scavengers and slowed physical disruption. Even when some sand entered a coffin, as excavation descriptions occasionally note, the body could still remain preserved. That tells us the system did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be better than open exposure in a destructive environment. A body protected early and dried early is much harder for later processes to erase completely. By the time centuries pass, the most important work has already been done. The grave mound itself probably helped with drainage and visibility. Xiaohe was built on an oblong mound in sandy terrain, and such elevated or clearly bounded cemetery space would tend to shed what little surface moisture arrived better than low, poorly drained ground. No one should imagine the mourners standing around with clipboards discussing soil permeability in modern terms, but practical burial traditions often end up favouring exactly the kinds of locations that later archaeologists praise for preservation. High, dry, recognisable ground is easier to find again, easier to keep separate from daily occupation, and often better for the dead physically as well. Human ritual and good drainage sometimes become allies without needing to exchange formal correspondence first. Then there is the matter of salt, which appears again and again in descriptions of Tarim mummy preservation. The broader literature on the basin frequently mentions saline soils as part of the preservation package, and the Xiaohe mitochondrial study specifically identifies the cemetery soil as high in salt. Salt is useful in preservation because it encourages dehydration and can make conditions less hospitable to some forms of microbial activity. It does not need to be applied like a deliberate preservative for this effect to matter. If the surrounding soil is already saline, then the body enters a burial chemistry inclined toward drying rather than putrefaction. One begins to see why the Tarim dead could survive in such a distinctive state. The desert was not simply dry in a vague postcard way. It was dry, salty, sandy, alkaline, and structurally helped by the cemetery's own burial technology. The result was a kind of natural curation, not perfect, not universal, but powerful enough that later scientists could recover ancient DNA, identify milk proteins in dental calculus, analyse textiles and leather, examine food remains, and reconstruct environmental conditions from plant evidence preserved at or in the graves. Had the bodies decayed more normally, much of that later work would have been impossible. Genes survive best under good preservation. Proteins survive better. Organic grave goods survive better. So the desert did not merely keep the bodies visible for dramatic photographs, it also made the science possible. In that sense, preservation shaped not only what we saw first, but what we were eventually able to know. There is also a more human side to all this. Preservation changes the emotional experience of archaeology. When only bone survives, we think in categories rather quickly: age, sex estimate, pathology, burial type, chronology. When eyelashes survive, everyone becomes temporarily less composed. The Tarim mummies repeatedly had that effect because the desert had preserved just enough personhood to disturb the neatness of our classifications. A lock of hair, a sewn boot, the fold of a wool cloak, the shape of a mouth. These things make it much harder to treat the dead as generic examples. Preservation therefore intensified not only scientific interest but public projection. People looked at these bodies and started making stories. They had to. A preserved face practically dares modern people to assume they understand where someone came from. That temptation would become crucial later, because the better preserved the bodies were, the stronger the first visual theories about them became, and perhaps that is the most important consequence of the desert's strange generosity. It did not simply save the dead from disappearance, it saved them so well that it encouraged overconfidence. The mummies looked legible, their clothes looked legible, their coffins looked legible. Everything about them seemed to offer direct access to an ancient story. But preservation can be deceptive that way. It makes evidence vivid without automatically making it simple. At Xiaohe, the desert preserved enough surface detail to invite confident conclusions long before the deeper biological evidence was in place. People saw the bodies and thought they knew the direction of the story. The sand, having done such a fine job of keeping them visible, had also made them dangerously easy to misread. That is where the next stage of the mystery really began, because once the bodies were preserved well enough to seem familiar, scholars and the wider public alike started trying to explain them. They reached for migration, ancestry, language, and lost connections across Eurasia. Some of those theories were thoughtful, some enthusiastic, and some rather too eager to promote a face into a full historical argument. The desert had kept the evidence intact, but it had not kept interpretation tidy. Once the bodies had been seen, photographed, and discussed, the next thing people did was exactly what people always do with striking archaeological finds. They began explaining them before the evidence was ready to cooperate. The Tarim mummies seemed to demand an origin story. They had preserved faces, preserved hair, preserved clothing, and they came from a region that already sat in scholarly imagination as a meeting point between Eastern and Western Eurasia. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, several competing explanations were already circulating to account for what the earliest Tarim sites appeared to represent. The major candidates eventually became well known: a steppe migration model linked to Afanasyevo and, in some versions, later Andronovo groups, an oasis farmer model linked to the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, often shortened to BMAC, and a broader mountain corridor or island biogeography model that treated the Tarim communities as shaped by cultural flows through inner Asia rather than by a single clean migration from one obvious homeland. The steppe theory was probably the most intuitive to many outside observers, partly because it offered the tidiest match between appearance and a familiar Bronze Age movement story. The 2021 Nature paper summarises it clearly. The Yamnaya/Afanasyevo steppe hypothesis held that Afanasyevo-related early Bronze Age populations in the Altai-Sayan zone spread southward via the Dzungarian Basin into the Tarim Basin, and founded the agripastoral communities of the Xiaohe horizon around 2000 BCE. The appeal of that idea was obvious. Afanasyevo groups were already connected in wider scholarship to westward and eastward steppe movements, animal husbandry, and in some linguistic arguments to the eastward dispersal of early Indo-European speech. If the Tarim mummies looked Western, wore wool, kept livestock and lived at the eastern edge of Inner Asia, then steppe migrants seemed, at first glance, like a reassuringly sensible answer. That steppe model was strengthened by another temptation, which was the Tocharian question. Tocharian, an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family, is attested in Buddhist manuscripts from the Tarim Basin, dating roughly to the 1st millennium CE. Because the language was Indo-European yet recorded so far to the east, scholars had long wondered how it got there. The Afanasyevo horizon offered one plausible route in linguistic theory, and Nature notes that some linguists hypothesized Afanasyevo dispersal brought the now extinct Tocharian branch eastward by the 3rd or 4th millennium BCE. It did not take much for that line of reasoning to merge with the visual shock of the mummies. If there were preserved Bronze Age bodies in the Tarim Basin that looked Western to modern eyes, and if later Tocharian texts were found in the region, then many observers began quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, turning one into the ancestor of the other. That leap, however, was always more confident than the evidence deserved. A 2019 dissertation review of Bronze Age Xinjiang research points out that the mummies were often considered related to Proto-Tocharian speakers because of their appearance and because Tocharian manuscripts were later found in the northeastern Tarim Basin, but it also stresses the major problem with that argument. The Bronze Age burials themselves contain no texts, and the chronological gap between the early cemeteries such as Xiaohe and Gumugu and the attested Tocharian manuscripts is enormous. The same review notes that there are not enough burial links to bridge that gap securely. Put more plainly, a language documented much later in one part of the basin does not automatically identify the speech of earlier communities elsewhere in the basin, even if both are interesting and both happen to involve deserts. The oasis farmer theory took a different route. Instead of looking north to the steppe, it looked southwest to the desert oases of Central Asia. Nature's summary describes the Bactrian oasis hypothesis as the idea that the Tarim Basin was initially colonized by farmers of the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, moving from the oasis zones of what are now Afghanistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan through the mountain systems of Central Asia. The appeal here was not facial appearance so much as the package of desert agriculture, irrigation analogies, and ritual parallels. Supporters pointed especially to similarities in adaptation to arid environments and to the ritual use of ephedra, a plant that appears both in BMAC contexts and in Xiaohe burials. In other words, if the steppe hypothesis explained the mummies through pastoral migration, the oasis hypothesis explained them through farmers and oasis specialists who already knew how to make difficult desert margins productive. And that theory had genuine attractions. The Tarim Basin is, after all, an oasis world, and some of the material at Xiaohe can indeed look more at home in an arid settlement system than in a pure grassland pastoral one. The same 2019 review notes that the oasis hypothesis treated the early settlers of the Tarim Basin as related to the spread of oasis-based agricultural groups from Bactria and Margiana. If you were trying to explain wheat, millet, desert adaptation, and certain ritual features in a coherent way, BMAC gave you a ready-made neighbouring civilization to point toward. This is a common pattern in archaeology. When you find a puzzling assemblage, the mind reaches first for the nearest known complex society that seems culturally sophisticated enough to explain it. It is not always wrong, but is often tidier than real prehistory turns out to be. Then there was a third style of explanation, less cleanly migratory and more ecological. The 2019 Archaeological Research in Asia paper by Betts Jia and Abu Duresuleh argued that while some early Xinjiang cultural groups can be broadly linked to outside influences, Xiaohe remained highly ambiguous archaeologically and might be better understood through an island biogeography framework. In that view, the Tarim Basin's oasis pockets acted a bit like islands within a sea of desert, allowing cultural traits and technologies to move in while populations themselves remained more localized or only selectively connected. Nature's later account folded part of this thinking into what it calls the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor hypothesis, in which Mountain Central Asia functioned not necessarily as a single-source population, but as a wider arena through which agro-pastoral practices and ideas could circulate. That kind of model is less dramatic than migrants arrived and founded everything, but often closer to how archaeology behaves when one stops forcing it to choose a single hero. The reason all these theories survived for as long as they did is that each had something to work with. The steppe model had the body's appearance, pastoral economy, and the later Tacharian puzzle. The BMAC model had oasis logic, desert adaptation, and ritual parallels such as ephedra. The corridor models had geography itself, with Xinjiang sitting between major regions and showing evidence of broader contact. Nature's 2021 paper is quite explicit that multiple contrasting hypotheses had been suggested precisely to explain the Western elements of the Xiaohe horizon. The problem was not that scholars were making things up from nothing. The problem was that the evidence could be read in more than one direction, and for a long time the available genetics were too limited to separate cultural borrowing from biological descent with any confidence. Earlier DNA work, unfortunately, helped and confused matters at the same time. The 2015 mitochondrial DNA study from Xiaohe reported diverse maternal lineages and argued that the Tarim Basin population had ancestry signals linking Europe, Central or Eastern Siberia, and Southern or Western Asia. It also framed the cemetery as a test case for the steppe versus Bactrian oasis hypotheses. Those findings did not amount to a full population history, but they were enough to encourage the sense that the mummies represented mixture from multiple outside regions. Combined with visual impressions and the cultural evidence, those partial genetic results made it easier for people to imagine the Xiao population as a kind of meeting ground assembled from far-flung migrants. That was not an irrational reading at the time, it was simply a reading built on lower resolution tools than scholars now have. There was also an older and deeper habit of thought underneath these theories, namely the habit of treating the mummies' visible features as though they carried a straightforward ethnic label. The 2019 Xinjiang Review captures that older mood when it notes that the brownish hair, deep eyes and high noses of the mummies were taken to imply they might be Europeans rather than Asians. That phrasing reflects a long period in which broad physical anthropological categories still shaped interpretation very strongly. Once remains are described in that way, the path from "they look Western" to "they came from the West" becomes dangerously short. It feels natural, but it bypasses all the awkward possibilities in between, including long-term local continuity, ancient ancestry no longer common elsewhere, or cultural adoption without large-scale population replacement. Some scholars pushed back on that reduction quite early. A 2005 paper by Christopher Thornton and Theodore Scher argued for multiple interpretations of the Tarim evidence and explicitly described their effort as a deconstruction of the reductionist narrative that had grown up around the mummies. A 2003 American Journal of Physical Anthropology article went further in a line quoted by later summaries, noting that the human remains from Kirigul may represent a local indigenous population from the Tarim Basin itself or surrounding highlands, not necessarily colonists from the steppe or Bactria. That sort of caution rarely gets as much public attention as a dramatic migration story, but it mattered. It meant that even before whole genome ancient DNA became available, some researchers were already warning that striking faces and broad analogies were doing too much of the work. Craniometric work also failed to produce the neat outside match that popular retellings often implied. Although some earlier analyses compared early Tarim skulls to Bronze Age populations of southern Siberia or Central Asia, later reassessments summarised in modern discussions found that the early Tarim samples formed a distinct cluster and did not show close affinities to the unadmixed remains of Steppe Afanasyevo or Andronovo colonists, nor to the BMAC populations often proposed as founders. That is an important detail because it shows that the archaeological imagination was always somewhat ahead of the anthropometric certainty. In other words, the simple stories were popular not because every line of evidence pointed the same way, but because the bodies were vivid and the west to east migration template was already waiting on the shelf. Even the archaeology itself offered warnings if one looked closely enough. The 2019 Xinjiang review notes that the Xiaohe horizon is thought to be quite different archaeologically from Afanasyevo culture. It also points out a particularly awkward detail for the pure steppe model. Despite all the talk of steppe influence and the importance of wheeled transport and horses in broader Bronze Age steppe development, there were no wheels or horses in the Xiaohogumugo cemeteries. That does not disprove outside contact, of course, but it does complicate any argument that Xiaohe was simply a transplanted version of a well-known steppe society. If people arrive from a famous horse and wheel horizon and then leave neither horses nor wheels in their signature cemeteries, one is entitled to become at least mildly suspicious of overconfident analogies. Theories about lost ancestors also flourished because the Tarim mummies landed at the intersection of several scholarly mysteries at once. They were connected, or seemed connected, to the problem of Indo-European dispersals. They touched on the emergence of oasis cultures in Xinjiang. They sat near later Silk Road routes. They were preserved well enough to encourage facial identification, and they came from a region that modern scholarship had long described as a crossroads. Under those conditions, almost any discovery will attract larger civilizational interpretations. Nature's 2021 paper captures that context well by describing Xinjiang as a major intersection of Eastern and Western cultures, languages, and peoples, while the 2019 Betts paper frames early Bronze Age Xinjiang as a zone of highly diverse cultural clusters occupying different environmental niches. The Tarim mummies therefore became not just human remains, but potential keys to a much bigger historical lock. That is almost always when theories become more adventurous than evidence deserves. There is also a more psychological reason these first theories took root. Migration stories are satisfying. They move, they connect maps, they give dramatic explanations for visual difference and cultural novelty. A genetically isolated local population that selectively adopts neighbouring technologies is a more subtle idea. It asks the audience to picture continuity under conditions of selective exchange, which is historically common but emotionally less flashy. By contrast, wanderers from the west crossed mountains and founded an oasis culture in the desert sounds like a proper story. It offers motion, identity, and a clear line of descent. Archaeology does not owe us satisfying stories, but we do keep trying to invoice it for them. What is striking in hindsight is how often the better questions were already visible, even while the louder answers dominated. Betts and colleagues emphasised the archaeological ambiguity of Xiaohe. Thornton and Schur emphasised multiple interpretations. The craniometric cautions suggested the early Tarim populations were not clean matches for proposed source populations, and the archaeological record itself showed a culture with very distinctive local features, including boat-shaped coffins, timber poles or oars, woven baskets, and a riverine oasis adaptation not replicated neatly elsewhere. These were clues that the story might not reduce to simple immigration from one side of the map. But they were quieter clues, and quieter clues rarely beat preserved faces in the public imagination. Then whole genome ancient DNA arrived, and did what good evidence often does when people have become a little too comfortable. It did not merely tweak the older theories, it rearranged the problem. The 2021 Nature study found that the earliest Tarim Basin individuals from the Xiaohe horizon did not derive substantial ancestry from Afanasyevo steppe groups, IAMC/BMA, sea-related populations, or other expected incoming founder groups. Instead, they belong to an ancient and isolated local gene pool related to Ancient North Eurasians. Nature's authors concluded that the Tarim mummies represented a culturally cosmopolitan but genetically isolated autochthonous population. In one move, that finding preserved part of what earlier theories had sensed correctly, namely that the Tarim communities were in contact with wider cultural worlds, while discarding the assumption that these wider contacts must reflect mass migration from the obvious candidate populations. That result did not make the old theories foolish. It made them historically useful. They show us what kinds of explanations become attractive when archaeology has vivid bodies, incomplete genetics, and a region already famous for movement and exchange. The steppe theory shows the power of visible resemblance and the Indo-European question. The oasis theory shows the appeal of matching desert lifeways to nearby oasis civilizations. The corridor models show a growing awareness that ideas and practices can travel differently from genes. Each theory captured a piece of the truth without holding the whole of it. That is often how scholarship works before a decisive line of evidence appears. People circle the right answer by assembling partial maps. So the first age of Tarim interpretation was a time of migrants, wanderers, and lost ancestors, because those were the categories scholars had at hand. They were trying to explain a visually startling people from an environmentally marginal basin, using the big Bronze Age stories already available: steppe dispersals, oasis expansions, mountain corridors, Indo-European languages. Some of those stories were insightful, some were overreaches. All of them, in one way or another, were attempts to turn an unsettlingly preserved local community into a recognizable branch of a broader Eurasian narrative. The trouble was that the mummies had been preserving a much less convenient answer all along, one that would only become clear once scientists stopped asking first who these people resembled and started asking what their genomes actually said. By the time the DNA entered the story, the Tarim mummies had already spent years doing what visually striking archaeological finds tend to do best, which is encouraging a great many confident opinions from people who have not yet heard from the molecules. The faces looked familiar in ways that sent scholars toward one set of explanations. The wool, the livestock, the grain, and the strange burial customs suggested a broader world of Bronze Age connections. The geography of Xinjiang, sitting between major regions of Inner Asia, made migration stories feel even more plausible. So when geneticists finally began asking what these people were biologically related to, the quiet expectation in the background was that the answer would probably tidy up the debate. It would tell everyone which of the competing stories had been right all along, and then one assumes everyone would congratulate science for being so helpful. The answer did settle the debate, but not in the polite way many people had hoped. The first thing the study had to do was establish exactly whom it was testing, because the phrase Tarim mummies can make it sound as though all of these bodies belong to one place and one moment. They did not. In the 2021 Nature study, researchers worked with 33 Bronze Age individuals from sites in both the Dzungarian and Tarim Basins of Xinjiang. From that larger pool, they recovered usable genome-wide data from 18 people in total. 5 early Bronze Age individuals from the Dzungarian Basin, dated to around 3000 to 2800 BCE, and 13 early to Middle Bronze Age individuals from the Tarim Basin, dated to around 2100 to 1700 BCE, most of them associated with the Xiaohe horizon. That distinction turned out to matter enormously, because the Dzungarian and Tarim groups were near one another geographically but not genetically the way many earlier theories had assumed. There is something quietly wonderful about the mechanics of that work as well, because ancient DNA is not the sort of thing one finds lying about in a cheerful and cooperative mood. The researchers sampled teeth and bones, worked in dedicated cleanroom ancient DNA laboratories, screened all 33 individuals, and ultimately retained 18 whose DNA quality was good enough for deeper analysis. One sample was discarded because of high modern contamination, which is a useful reminder that even when the dead are preserved by a desert, the living can still blunder into the data if no one is careful. The team sequenced some libraries directly, enriched others for a large panel of nuclear markers, and processed the resulting reads with methods specifically designed to handle the damage patterns typical of ancient DNA. It is not especially romantic, but then the truth is that science often reaches its most dramatic conclusions only after an impressive amount of controlled fussing with powders, clean suits, and very strict rules about where your skin cells are allowed to go. What the researchers were really doing was giving the old theories a fair test. If the Tarim mummies were descendants of Afanasievo steppe migrants, their genomes should show that. If they came from oasis farming populations connected to the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, their genomes should show that too. If they were part of some wider mountain corridor population already mixing Western and Eastern ancestry through Inner Asia, that pattern should leave a trace. And because the study included both the Tarim Basin and the neighbouring Dzungarian Basin, it had a built-in comparison. Dzungaria lay to the north, closer to the routes by which steppe populations could have entered Xinjiang. So if Afanasievo ancestry was moving into the region, one would expect to see it there clearly enough. That is exactly what happened in Dzungaria, which made what happened in the Tarim Basin even stranger. The Dzungarian individuals behaved more or less as many archaeologists would have predicted. The Nature paper found that the early Bronze Age Dzungarian groups were best modelled as mixtures dominated by Afanasievo ancestry, with additional local and Baikal-related contributions. In simple terms, the northern basin really did show the sort of westward steppe signals scholars had been expecting to find somewhere in Xinjiang. The Dzungarian samples clustered genetically with Afanasievo-related populations from the Altai-Sayan region, and the study concluded that Afanasievo ancestry, without requiring additional Inner Asian mountain corridor contributions, was enough to explain the Western Eurasian component in those northern individuals. That result was important not only because it confirmed the eastward reach of steppe ancestry, but because it showed the methods were working exactly where earlier models said they should. The genetic tools were not failing, they were seeing what was there, and then the Tarim individuals did something much less cooperative. Instead of clustering with Afanasievo or with BMAC-related oasis populations, or with some mixed Inner Asian package that would make everyone feel sensible, the early Middle Bronze Age Tarim individuals formed a tight cluster of their own. The Nature paper says plainly that the Tarim individuals contained only local ancestry, and that the results did not support the previous hypotheses that the Tarim mummies were Proto-Tocharian-speaking pastoralists descended from Afanasievo, or people originating among BMAC or Inner Asian mountain corridor cultures. The Max Planck summary put the point even more sharply for a broader audience. The mummies were not Indo-European-speaking migrants from the West, as many had thought, but a local indigenous Bronze Age population with deep Asian roots. That was the reveal. Not a westward founder population suddenly confirmed in the desert, but a local population that had been there all along. This is the moment where people are often tempted to say, so they were locals, as though that solves everything neatly. But local in this case does not mean ordinary in any modern sense. The study found that the Tarim group belonged to an isolated gene pool whose origins could be traced back much deeper than the Bronze Age migration stories people had been arguing about. Their genetic affinities linked them strongly to the Ancient North Eurasian, or ANE, ancestry known from far older populations of northern Eurasia. The Nature paper describes the Tarim cluster as close to pre-Bronze Age Central Steppe, and Siberian individuals with high ANE ancestry, and the Max Planck release describes them as descendants of a population connected to a once wider Pleistocene ancestry that had largely disappeared elsewhere by the end of the last ice age. In other words, the DNA did not merely say, "You were looking in the wrong place," it said, "You were looking in the wrong era." That is part of what made the findings so surprising. Scholars had spent years asking which Bronze Age migrants founded the Tarim communities. The genomes responded by pointing toward a much older ancestry layer that had survived locally in unusually concentrated form. The Max Planck summary says the Tarim mummies showed no evidence of admixture with any other Holocene groups, and instead formed a previously unknown genetic isolate that likely underwent an extreme and prolonged bottleneck before settling the Tarim Basin. That is a remarkable sentence in population history. It means the earlier studied Tarim group was not just somewhat distinct, it was unusually distinct even against the background of Bronze Age Eurasia, where populations were already mixing, moving and recombining on a fairly ambitious scale. All around the basin there was genetic interaction. In the Tarim group there was strikingly little of it. This, incidentally, is why the mummies' so-called Western physical appearance turned out to be such a trap. Nature's discussion section states that their Western features were probably due to their connection to the ancient ANE gene pool, not because they were straightforward descendants of the later Western Steppe or Oasis group scholars had proposed. That is a subtle but hugely important distinction. They looked to modern viewers as though they belonged in a familiar west to east migration story. Their DNA said otherwise. The appearance was real enough as a visual impression, but the historical shortcut people took from appearance to recent ancestry was not. A face is not a family tree, and in the Tarim Basin it turned out to be a particularly unreliable travel brochure. The real brilliance of the study is that it did not stop at disproving earlier theories. It also explained why the old theories had seemed so plausible in the first place. The Tarim Basin mummies were genetically isolated, yes, but they were not culturally isolated. The Nature paper emphasises that the Siawi populations adopted neighbouring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices, and the Max Planck summary calls them remarkably culturally cosmopolitan. They built a subsistence system around elements from several surrounding worlds: wheat and dairy linked to Western Asia, millet linked to East Asia, and medicinal plants such as ephedra connected to Central Asian traditions. So the archaeology had not been wrong to notice broad cultural connections. It had only been wrong, or sometimes too eager, in assuming those connections had to reflect large-scale incoming ancestry from the obvious candidate populations. That contrast becomes even clearer when one looks at the proteomic evidence the researchers folded into the study. The Xiaowi individuals showed strong evidence of milk proteins in their dental calculus, indicating a reliance on dairy pastoralism at the site since its founding. The Max Planck summary goes further and notes that proteomic analysis confirmed cattle, sheep, and goat dairying among the founding population. This matters because dairying had often been treated as one of the clues pointing toward incoming steppe groups, yet here it was appearing in a population that the genomes showed to be locally rooted and genetically isolated. So the evidence no longer supported the old habit of bundling dairy, wool, and livestock into a single migration package. Instead, it suggested that the Tarim people had learned, borrowed, or absorbed useful pastoral practices without being biologically overwritten by the neighbours from whom such practices may originally have spread. That is one of the deepest implications of the DNA results. Human groups do not need to be genetically blended in order to become culturally entangled. The earliest Tarim communities could adopt crops, dairy practices, and perhaps technologies from very different regions, while still remaining a tight-knit and unusually isolated population. Nature's authors say exactly this when they describe the Xiaohe horizon as a population that was aware of different technologies and cultures outside the Tarim Basin, and developed its own distinctive culture in response to the extreme challenges of the Taklamakan Desert and its riverine oases. If anything, the DNA made the archaeology more interesting rather than less. These were not passive recipients of a new way of life carried in by a founding migration. They were active adapters in a harsh environment, choosing from the menu of neighbouring possibilities and building something that was recognisably their own. There is also something rather elegant about how the Zungurian comparison sharpened the Tarim result. The neighbouring northern basin did in fact show Afanasyevo ancestry. The Tarim Basin did not. That means the eastward movement of steppe-related populations into Xinjiang was real, but it did not automatically define every Bronze Age group in the region. Nature's authors note that Tocharian may plausibly have been introduced to the Zungarian Basin by Afanasyevo migrants during the early Bronze Age. even while the earliest Tarim Basin cultures arose from a genetically isolated local population. So the DNA did not collapse the whole regional story into one answer. It split it more accurately into two related but different histories, one in the north with strong steppe ancestry, one in the south with an isolated local population that adopted outside cultural elements. The basin, in other words, was already behaving in a complicated and geographically uneven way, which is exactly what real landscapes have a habit of doing when scholars would prefer a cleaner slide. It is worth pausing over the word autochthonous here, because the Nature paper uses it carefully. The authors define it not as some mystical claim of eternal sameness, but as a genetic profile that has been present in a region for millennia rather than being associated with more recently arrived groups. That definition matters because it keeps the discussion grounded. The early Tarim group was local in the sense of long regional continuity, not in the sentimental sense people sometimes attach to the word. They were not untouched by history. They were part of history, and their very distinctiveness was itself a historical outcome, probably shaped by long isolation, bottlenecks, and life in a difficult oasis environment. The DNA reveal was therefore not a fairy tale about pure originals. It was a population history result about deep continuity under unusual conditions. The public summaries of the study caught the shock of that result very well. National Geographic described the 2021 work as leading to a new consensus that the mummies belonged to an isolated group living in the Bronze Age Tarim region, adopting neighbours' farming practices while remaining distinct in culture and genetics. Max Planck called them a local indigenous population with deep Asian roots and a taste for far-flung cuisine. Those are different styles of writing, but they point to the same core discovery. The mummies were not what their first dramatic photographs encouraged many people to believe. Their lives were interwoven with wider Eurasian foodways and technologies, yet their genomes did not point to the neat immigrant founder populations most often proposed for them. This is why the DNA felt revelatory. It did not just answer a question, it changed which question made sense to ask next. And perhaps the most satisfying part of the reveal is that it did not flatten the Tarim mummies into something less mysterious. It made them more human instead. Before the DNA, they were often imagined as symbols in a migration argument, dramatic bodies standing in for lost tribes, proto-Tocharians, or westward wanderers crossing deserts with destiny and good cheekbones. After the DNA, they became something richer and more plausible. A small, tightly knit oasis population surviving in a difficult environment, carrying an unexpectedly old ancestry, and building a culture from materials and practices gathered across neighbouring worlds. That is, in many ways, a far more believable human story. People rarely live as pure embodiments of one grand historical force. They live locally, borrow selectively, and make do with what the landscape and their neighbours offer. The Tarim genomes confirmed exactly that. The reveal also carried a quiet warning for anyone who enjoys assigning language too quickly. The earlier theories had often tied the mummies to Proto-Tocharian-speaking pastoralists descending from Afanasyevo. The Nature paper rejects that as direct explanation for the earliest Tarim mummies, even while allowing that Tocharian may have reached the broader region through Afanasyevo-linked groups in Dzungaria. So the DNA did not tell us what language the Siauhi people spoke. It told us we could no longer pretend their speech followed automatically from the old migration model. Genes, culture, and language had to be treated as separate problems, even if they sometimes touch one another. That is less convenient, certainly, but convenience has never been one of the more reliable features of prehistory. By this point, then, the real meaning of the DNA had become clear. It revealed that the earliest Tarim Basin mummies were neither recent Western migrants nor simple descendants of the main Bronze Age population scholars had lined up to explain them. They were a genetically isolated local population with deep roots, shaped by an ancestry profile connected to Ancient North Eurasians, living in a region where other groups were mixing far more visibly, and yet fully capable of adopting outside crops, dairying, and technologies. The old theories had looked for the answer in a grand incoming migration. The DNA found it in long survival, selective adaptation, and a population history much older than the argument itself. And once that door was open, the next realization followed almost at once. These people were not just unusual compared with what scholars had expected, they were unusual compared with almost anyone alive now, which is where the story takes its next turn. Once the genomic work had pushed aside the first wave of migration theories, the next task was harder, because it required a little restraint. It is one thing to say the Tarim mummies were not what many people expected. It is another to explain what they actually were without turning the answer into something theatrical. The most accurate version is not that they belonged to some lost race, or a vanished people from nowhere, or a mysterious civilization with no human relatives. It is simpler and stranger than that. The earliest Tarim Basin mummies studied at genome-wide scale seem to represent a population whose genetic profile does not survive intact in any living group today. That is the key point. Not that they were beyond human comparison, but that no present-day population is a clean, direct match for them. The 2021 Nature study that changed this discussion most dramatically analysed genome-wide data from 13 early Middle Bronze Age individuals from the Tarim Basin, dating to roughly 2100 to 1700 BCE, along with 5 early Bronze Age individuals from the neighbouring Dzungarian Basin, dated to around 3000 to 2800 BCE. That comparison mattered a great deal. The Dzungarian individuals showed predominantly Afanassieva ancestry, with some local contribution, which fit the broader picture of west to east steppe movement. The Tarim individuals did not. The Tarim group contained only local ancestry in the study's modelling, and did not support the older theories that had linked them directly to Afanassievo pastoralists, BMAC founders, or Inner-Asian mountain corridor populations as their principal source. That result alone was important, but the real surprise lay deeper. The researchers concluded that the earliest Tarim Basin cultures appear to have arisen from a genetically isolated local population that adopted neighbouring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices. The Max Planck summary of the same work makes the point even more sharply, stating that the Tarim Basin mummies were not newcomers to the region, but direct descendants of a once widespread Pleistocene population known as the Ancient North Eurasians, or ANE, a population that had largely disappeared by the end of the last ice age. That phrasing matters because it moves the story away from recent Bronze Age migration and toward very old ancestry that had survived in unusual form. Ancient North Eurasians are not a speculative label invented for dramatic effect. They are a recognised ancestry profile identified through ancient DNA work on Upper Paleolithic and later populations from northern Eurasia. By 2014, ancient genome studies had already shown that ANE ancestry contributed to many later populations, including Europeans, but usually only as one component among several. One Nature-era summary of that work noted that ANE ancestry was inferred to be present in nearly all Europeans, but generally at a maximum of about 20%. In other words, by the Holocene, and certainly by recent history, ANE ancestry mostly survived in fragments, diluted and recombined within later populations rather than preserved in a single unmixed form. That is what makes the Tarim result so unusual. The Max Planck release describes the Bronze Age Tarim mummies as showing no evidence of admixture with any other Holocene groups, forming instead a previously unknown genetic isolate that likely underwent an extreme and prolonged bottleneck before settling the Tarim Basin. The Nature paper itself says the Tarim individuals contain only local ancestry, and explicitly defines autochthonous in this context as a genetic profile present in a region for millennia, rather than one associated with more recently arrived groups. So when people say the Tarim mummies were unlike any living population, what they mean is that their particular ancestry package, preserved in that isolated form, no longer exists in living people as a whole profile. That is a subtle point, but it matters enormously, because it is very easy to mishear it. It does not mean the Tarim people were somehow outside the normal human family, and it does not mean they had no descendants in any sense whatsoever. It means that the specific genetic combination seen in those early Tarim individuals is not preserved unchanged in any present-day population that has been sampled so far. Their ancestry was old, heavily isolated and distinctive by Bronze Age standards, and later human populations in Inner Asia and beyond were shaped by many subsequent mixtures that blurred or redistributed those older signals. A genetic isolate is unusual, not supernatural. Archaeology has enough work to do already without anyone inventing extra species between tea breaks. The modern echoes of that ancestry are still there, but only as echoes. The Max Planck account says the ANE-related population to which the Tarim mummies belonged survives only fractionally in living genomes, with indigenous populations in Siberia and the Americas carrying the highest known proportions at about 40%. The earlier 2014 work on European population history likewise found ANE ancestry nearly everywhere in Europe, though only as a smaller component. So the Tarim people were not cut off from all later humanity in a literal sense. Rather, they appear to preserve a version of ANE-related ancestry that later populations retained only in partial form after additional layers of admixture accumulated over time. There is something useful, if slightly unromantic, about thinking of it that way. Imagine finding a very old dialect recorded clearly enough that you can hear its grammar and sounds before they were blended into the later languages around it. You would not say no modern language has any connection to it. You would say no one still speaks that old dialect in its original form. The Tarim mummies are a bit like that genetically. Their ancestry is not absent from the modern world in every trace, but the full early Tarim profile does not appear to survive as a living population identity now. It is a preserved branch, not a complete disappearance, and not a living continuation in unmixed form. A later 2022 whole genome study of modern Central Asians helps make that point more concrete. That paper found that present-day Tajik populations derive most of their ancestry from admixture between Bronze Age BMA, C-related and Andronovo-related groups, while Highland Tajik populations received an additional gene flow from the Tarim mummies. It also noted that Tajiks have a higher proportion of ANE-related ancestry than other modern Central Asians in the author's data set. That is interesting, but it is not the same thing as saying Tajiks are simply Tarim mummies in modern dress. Their major ancestry profile comes from other mixed Bronze Age sources, with Tarim-related ancestry as one added layer among several. The old signal lingers, but it does not dominate. This is one reason the original 2021 finding felt so unexpected. Xinjiang was already known as a crossroads. The Tarim Basin sat amid long-term exchanges of crops, animals, technologies, and eventually languages. The most intuitive expectation in such a region is that early populations would be biologically mixed in the same broad way that their material culture was mixed. But the Tarim mummies broke that expectation. The Max Planck summary stresses that they were genetically isolated, but not culturally isolated. Proteomic work on dental calculus confirmed dairying of cattle, sheep, and goats. Archaeological and botanical evidence ties them to wheat and dairy from Western Asia, millet from East Asia, and ephedra associated with Central Asian traditions. Their genes said one thing, their daily life another. That distinction is one of the most important lessons in the whole Tarim story. Biology and culture do not travel in lockstep. A population can remain unusually isolated at the genetic level while adopting foodways, herding practices, crops, and technologies from neighbours. The Nature paper puts this directly. The earliest Tarim Basin cultures appear to have arisen from a genetically isolated local population that adopted neighbouring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices, enabling them to settle and thrive along the shifting riverine oases of the Taklamakan Desert. Their material culture looked connected because it was connected. Their ancestry looked isolated because it was isolated. Both were true at once. This also helps explain why the faces misled so many people at first. when modern viewers saw naturally preserved bodies with what they described as Western features, wool garments, livestock economies, and boat-shaped coffins, they assumed they were looking at recent west to east migrants. But the DNA showed that visible resemblance did not map neatly onto the Bronze Age migration stories people preferred. What seemed at first like evidence of newcomers turned out to be evidence of a deeply rooted local population, carrying a very old ancestry profile. The faces were real. The mistaken shortcut from face to origin was the problem. There is another point here that deserves care, because isolated population can easily be misunderstood as small, frozen, or primitive. None of those would be fair descriptions. The Tarim people were clearly adaptive and resourceful. They practiced dairying, they used multiple cereal traditions, they managed a cattle-centered economy, they occupied oasis landscapes in an environment that punished carelessness. Their isolation was genetic, not intellectual. In fact, if anything, the evidence points in the opposite direction. They were culturally flexible enough to borrow and integrate useful practices from very different surrounding worlds without dissolving biologically into them at once. That is not primitiveness. That is competence under pressure. The phrase deep Asian roots, used in the Max Planck summary, is especially helpful here because it pulls the story away from the Old West versus East framing. The Tarim mummies were once often imagined as Europeans in the wrong place, or Proto-Europeans in a dramatic desert detour. The genomic evidence does not support that. The ANE lineage to which they were largely connected was an ancient Northern Eurasian ancestry, and the specific Tarim isolate had developed in Inner Asia rather than arriving wholesale from some later Western Bronze Age migration. The old language of Western-looking mummies captured a visual impression, but obscured the real depth of the ancestry involved. It is worth adding that the Tarim profile was not simply a dead end in the basin's later history. A 2025 current biology study expanded the picture, with genome-wide data from 24 individuals from the Western Tarim Basin spanning the Bronze and Iron Ages. That work found that later Western Tarim populations were shaped by steppe-related groups, BMAC-related admixture, and indigenous Tarim ancestry. One of its headline conclusions was that indigenous ancestry persisted in Iron Age groups across the Tarim Basin, and the authors even identified an Iron Age individual from the Western Basin who appears largely unaffected by the steppe influx. So the early Tarim legacy did not vanish overnight. It endured, but increasingly as one ancestry layer within a more heterogeneous regional population history. That later evidence is useful because it stops the 2021 result from being oversimplified in the opposite direction. The earlier studied Tarim mummies formed a very distinctive isolate, yes, but the Tarim Basin did not remain genetically static forever. By the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, different parts of the basin were integrating new populations and ancestry streams. The 2025 study suggests at least two separate waves facilitated steppe entry into Xinjiang, and that Western Tarim Bronze Age groups derived much of their ancestry from early Western steppe expansions, later mixed with BMAC-related and indigenous Tarim groups. In other words, the basin eventually became the kind of genetically layered crossroads many people had originally imagined, just not in the earliest Xiaohe phase they had first tried to explain. That timing matters. The early Tarim mummies were unusual not because the basin was always isolated, but because they preserved an early stage before later admixture fully reworked the regional gene pool. They are valuable precisely because they sit near the start of the documented sequence, and still retain a lineage in unusually concentrated form. Later populations in the basin show what usually happens next in human history: more contact, more mixture, more ancestry layers, and fewer chances of finding a community that still looks like a genetic time capsule. The early mummies are therefore important not only in themselves but as a baseline for understanding how the Tarim Basin changed afterward. There is also a more general lesson here about how modern populations relate to ancient ones. We tend to ask archaeology for direct ancestors because that feels tidy. We want to know who became whom. But ancient DNA keeps reminding us that human history does not usually work in straight lines. Some populations vanish as distinct groups while leaving ancestry fragments behind in many later peoples. Some survive mainly through cultural influence rather than genes. Some are absorbed so thoroughly that no living population preserves them in anything like their original form. The Tarim mummies belong largely to that middle category, not erased, not intact, but redistributed into later histories in smaller amounts, while their original isolate disappeared. That is why a people unlike any living population is a fair phrase if used carefully. It does not mean nobody alive shares anything with them. It means nobody alive, so far as the available genomic evidence shows, represents the same distinct, unmixed early Tarim genetic profile. Their closest parallels lie not in a living nation or ethnicity, but in an ancient ancestry component that later populations carry only partially and in combination with many other lineages. They are, in that sense, one of those rare archaeological groups that force modern categories to back away and admit they arrived too late, and perhaps that is the most useful way to hold them in mind. Not as a lost tribe waiting to be assigned to someone modern, and not as a curiosity that existed outside ordinary human history, but as a real Bronze Age community whose ancestry happened to preserve an older chapter of Eurasian population history more clearly than almost anyone expected. They herded, cooked, buried their dead, wore wool, fermented dairy, and lived in a difficult oasis world. At the same time, their genomes preserved a population history that had mostly been broken up elsewhere long before. That combination is what makes them so compelling. Their daily lives were practical, their ancestry was extraordinary, and once you see both together, the next question becomes less about who they resemble now and more about what kinds of language, belief, and cultural memory could have grown around such a community in the first place. The difficulty with language is that it almost never preserves as kindly as wool or hair. A body can survive in a desert for thousands of years and still keep enough of its face to unsettle a museum visitor. But the words once spoken around that body are far easier to lose. They vanish with breath, with memory, with generations, and unless someone writes them down, they tend to disappear more completely than almost anything else archaeology studies. That is the first thing to keep in mind here, because the Tarim mummies have given us bones, textiles, dairy proteins, grave goods, and genomes, but they have not given us a sentence. Not one line from Xiaohe tells us what those people called themselves, what they called the dead, what they called milk, river, boat, child, grief, cattle, sun, or sand. So any discussion of language has to begin with that restraint. The early Bronze Age Tarim mummies are historically vivid, but linguistically silent. That silence is exactly why the Tocharian question has hovered over them for so long. Tocharian is the conventional name for two closely related Indo-European languages once spoken in the Tarim Basin, and the surviving manuscripts place them in the northern oases of the basin during the latter half of the first millennium CE, not in the early second millennium BCE world of Xiaohe. Britannica dates the attested Tocharian materials to roughly AD 500 to 700, and places Tocharian A in the Turfan region to the east, and Tocharian B chiefly around Kucha in the west, while Encyclopaedia Iranica adds Karashar to that landscape, and notes that Tocharian B seems originally tied to Kucha, with later spread eastward. That matters because it immediately introduces both distance and specificity. The written Tocharian world we know is later than the early Tarim mummies by well over 2,000 years, and is concentrated in northern oasis towns, not in the Jawi cemetery world itself. Even the name Tocharian comes with a warning label. Iranica notes that while the conventional term remains standard, there is broad agreement that the speakers of Tocharian A and B cannot simply be equated with the historical Tokharoi of Afghanistan mentioned in Greek, Latin and Sanskrit sources. In other words, one of the most familiar labels in this whole field is also a bit of a historical misfit. That does not make it unusable, but it does remind us how easily names, languages and peoples get stitched together across time by later scholarship. If even the label is partly inherited confusion, then attaching it too quickly to Bronze Age mummies without texts becomes even more precarious. The genomic evidence did not remove that uncertainty, it sharpened it. The 2021 Nature study is very clear on 2 points that have to be held together. First, the data do not support the older view that the Tarim mummies were straightforward Proto-Tocharian-speaking pastoralists descended from Afanasievo migrants. Second, the same study does not prove that the Bronze Age Tarim populations did not speak an early form of Tocharian. Instead, it sees the question remains unanswered. Nature puts it bluntly. While Afanasievo populations in the Dzungarian Basin may plausibly have introduced Indo-European languages to the region, the material, culture and genetic profile of the Tarim mummies call into question simplistic assumptions about the link between genetics, culture and language, and leave open whether the Bronze Age Tarim populations spoke a form of Proto-Tocharian. That is about as clear and cautious as scholarship gets. That caution matters because the older temptation was always to treat genes, objects and language as though they moved in one tidy bundle. If a population looked Western to modern observers, wore wool, kept cattle, and occupied the eastern edge of Inner Asia, then perhaps they must have been Indo-European speakers. If later manuscripts in the Tarim Basin were Tocharian, then perhaps these earlier mummies must have been their direct linguistic ancestors. The 2021 study is useful precisely because it breaks that chain. It shows that the earliest Tarim Basin cultures arose from a genetically isolated local population that adopted neighbouring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices, and it stresses that the Tarim mummies were culturally cosmopolitan but genetically isolated. Once you accept that, language becomes something that has to be argued independently, not assumed from either faces or genes. There is still, however, a reason Tocharian remains in the conversation at all. The same Nature paper says that Tocharian may plausibly have been introduced into the Dzungarian Basin by Afanasievo migrants during the early Bronze Age. That is important because the Dzungarian Basin, to the north of the Tian Shan, is the likely corridor by which steppe-related populations and perhaps Indo-European speech could have entered broader Xinjiang. So the modern position is not that Tocharian has no Bronze Age depth in the region, it is that the early Tarim mummies from Xiaohe are not the simple genetic proof of that story that earlier interpretations hoped they were. The route into Xinjiang may still involve Afanasievo-related populations, but the earliest Tarim oasis communities cannot just be folded into that migration, as if the problem had solved itself. The distance between language and ancestry becomes even clearer when one looks at the first millennium CE Tarim Basin as a whole. It was not a single language landscape. Mallory's overview in the Penn Museum publication stresses that the basin hosted many languages, some clearly introduced from outside by merchants, missionaries, administrators, or conquerors, and others perhaps more deeply rooted. He notes that Sogdian, Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, Avestan and Chinese were all present in the region in various contexts, while Tocharian and Khotanese Saka were among the main languages likely spoken by substantial local populations. That multilingual reality is exactly what one would expect in an oasis world linked by trade routes and religious networks. It also makes it dangerous to assign one language retroactively to every earlier population, simply because that language later became visible in manuscripts. Tocharian itself seems to have occupied a distinctive niche in that later world. Mallory notes that it appears both in Buddhist texts and in administrative documents, which suggests it was not limited to a priestly or literary class. He also points out that the surviving documents imply Tocharian A had become a largely liturgical language by the time of the manuscripts, while Tocharian B was still actively used. Britannica and Iranica are broadly consistent with that picture. Tocharian A is associated mainly with Turfan and Karashar, Tocharian B with Kuchar and later spread eastward, and the manuscript corpus is overwhelmingly Buddhist in content, though not exclusively so. This is useful because it tells us that by the first millennium CE, the northern Tarim oases supported literate Buddhist Indo-European speaking communities with local administrative life, not just isolated monks copying scriptures in a forgotten tongue. But even there, the echoes are indirect. The world of Kucha and Turfan was not the world of Xiaoyi preserved unchanged. It was a later oasis civilization shaped by Buddhism, long-distance trade, manuscript culture, and political connections stretching across Inner Asia. The environmental logic of oasis life remained, of course, because the basin still required people to live along watered margins, but the social and religious texture had changed dramatically. If there is a line from Bronze Age Tarim communities to those later manuscript cultures, it is not a line of obvious continuity in burial custom or material style. It is more likely a line of place, adaptation, and partial ancestry running through a region that kept reworking old populations into new cultural forms. Khotanese shows that even more clearly. Iranica describes Khotanese as an Eastern Middle Iranian language spoken along the southern rim of the Tarim Basin, along what would later be known as the Southern Silk Road, and it remained in use until around 1000 CE. It is attested in Old, Middle and Late stages from the 5th through 10th centuries, with manuscripts from Khotan proper and eastward, as far as Ender and Dunhuang. That means the Tarim Basin in historical times was not only home to Tocharian on its northern side, but also to Iranian-speaking Buddhist kingdoms on the south. So when we ask about the echoes left by the early Tarim populations, one sensible answer is that their descendants and neighbours ended up participating in a basin that became linguistically plural rather than culturally uniform. The Tarim did not preserve one ancient language in amber. It became a zone where several language traditions overlapped. That multilingual outcome also helps explain why the Bronze Age silence matters so much. Mallory explicitly warns that once one subtracts the clearly imported languages of later religion, trade, Chinese administration, and Turkic expansion, one is still left with uncertainty about what languages were associated with at least some of the Bronze and Iron Age mummies, and he adds that totally different languages may have been spoken by populations derived from older native groups whose languages did not survive into the historical record. That is one of the most important sentences in the whole debate. It means the early Tarim mummies may have spoken a form of Proto-Tocharian, or something related, or something entirely lost. The archaeological and genetic evidence cannot decide that by itself. The basin may have erased whole language families without leaving us so much as a bilingual inscription to be grateful for. And yet culture often survives in other ways even when speech does not. The Xiaohe community left behind a very distinctive material world. Nature's 2021 paper emphasises that they combined wheat, barley and millet with dairying, and buried their dead with ephedra twigs in a style reminiscent of Central Asian oasis cultures, while also developing features not found elsewhere in Xinjiang, including boat-shaped wooden coffins covered with cattle hides, marked by timber poles or oars, and a preference for woven baskets over pottery. That mixture matters because it shows that even if we cannot recover their spoken language, we can recover a cultural grammar. They borrowed selectively, adapted aggressively, and still made something recognisably their own. The water symbolism proposed in the recent Xiaohe funerary study fits that same pattern. Caspary argues that the inverted boat coffins and associated grave markers make best sense in the context of a riverine oasis culture, where water was central both practically and symbolically. He is careful to note that parts of this remain interpretive rather than certain, but the general claim is persuasive. The Xiaoyi dead were being connected to the waters that sustained life in the oasis, and the visual language of boats, paddles, and reflected worlds may have linked daily survival to the passage into death. That may not tell us what words they used for soul or afterlife, but it does tell us something about the metaphors their community likely found meaningful. A culture leaves echoes not only in texts, but in what it chooses to repeat around the dead. Foodways may be another of those echoes. The same Nature paper notes that the Xiaohe population made cheese from ruminant milk using a kefir-like fermentation, and cultivated wheat, barley and millet, while also lacking genetic lactose persistence. That combination is revealing because it shows a community capable of adopting and integrating technologies from different neighbouring worlds while solving local nutritional problems in practical ways. Fermented dairy, mixed cereals, and oasis adaptation are cultural choices as much as subsistence facts. They are exactly the kinds of things that can persist through social contact even when ancestry remains relatively isolated, and exactly the kinds of practices that later oasis societies of the Tarim Basin would also continue to rely upon, though in different forms and under different identities. There is also a demographic echo now visible in the later genetic record. The 2025 current biology study of 24 individuals from the Western Tarim Basin found that Bronze Age Western Tarim populations were heavily shaped by steppe-related ancestry, later mixed with B, Ma, C-related and indigenous Tarim groups, and that indigenous ancestry persisted in Iron Age groups across the basin. The authors even identify an Iron Age individual in the Western Tarim Basin who appears largely unaffected by the main steppe influx, suggesting that a long-lasting indigenous legacy endured for more than 1,000 years. That is important because it means the early Tarim populations did not simply vanish, as if the desert had folded over them and moved on. Their biological legacy persisted, even as later populations became more heterogeneous and culturally more entangled with the wider worlds around them. That persistence helps us think more carefully about cultural continuity as well. It would be too simple to say that the Siauhe people later became the Tocharians, or later became the Khotanese, or later became any one documented historical group. The evidence does not justify that. But it would also be too simple to say they disappeared without consequence. The later Tarim Basin inherited a landscape already organised by oasis adaptation, mobile exchange and local survival in extreme conditions. The 2025 study's evidence for long-lived indigenous ancestry suggests that at least some local population continuity ran beneath the more visible overlays of later steppe movement, BMA admixture, Buddhism, Iranian languages, Tocharian manuscripts, Chinese administration, and eventually Turkicization. The echoes, then, are not a single surviving name. They are the continued presence of local people inside later historical mixtures. That makes the linguistic picture both richer and more frustrating. By the first millennium CE, Tocharian and Khotanese are historically visible, and both are Indo-European, though from very different branches. Tocharian belongs to its own extinct branch, while Khotanese is Eastern Iranian. Sogdian, Prakrit, Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and later Turkic also move through the basin in different ways. This is not the sort of setting where one should expect a single tidy linguistic ancestry for all earlier populations. It is a setting where older languages could have been replaced, absorbed, or narrowed to ritual functions, where migrants could arrive without immediately overwhelming local populations, and where local communities might carry biological continuity across multiple language shifts. That complexity is precisely why nature warns against simplistic assumptions linking genetics, culture, and language. There is even a small irony in how the manuscripts themselves survived. Britannica notes that Tocharian literature was preserved in Buddhist manuscripts discovered largely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, while Iranica emphasises that the corpus is made up mostly of fragmentary Buddhist texts, with some administrative and legal materials as well. Their preservation depended once again on the basin's dry climate. The same environmental harshness that preserved Bronze Age mummies also preserved later paper, wood, and palm leaf texts. So the Tarim Basin has given us two very different kinds of human remainder from two very different ages, bodies from the Bronze Age and manuscripts from the first millennium CE. The trouble is that the gap between them is still larger than we would like. The desert preserved both ends of the puzzle more kindly than most places would have done, but it still did not hand us the middle neatly tied up. Perhaps the safest way to speak of the echoes they left behind is this. The early Tarim populations do not speak directly to us in writing, but they do leave behind a pattern that later Tarim history never quite abandons. They show us a basin where local continuity can survive alongside borrowed practices, where biological isolation does not prevent cultural exchange, where marginal environments reward adaptation rather than purity, and where no one line of evidence is enough to define a people. Later Tocharian-speaking Buddhist communities in the north, Khotanese-speaking kingdoms in the south, and the many traders, monks, scribes, and administrators who crossed the basin all inhabited a world already shaped by those same structural facts. They did not inherit Xiaohe whole, but they inherited the kind of place that could produce Xiaohe. And that may be why this story remains so difficult to simplify. We would like the mummies to resolve into a known language, a known people, a known road of descent. Instead, they sit just before the written record becomes generous enough to help us, and just far enough behind the historical oasis kingdoms to resist easy adoption by them. Their culture is visible, their ancestry is visible, their burial rituals are visible, but their words are gone. What remains are traces, a later Tarim Basin that became famously multilingual, a genetic legacy that endured in later populations, material practices that show a deep capacity for selective adaptation, and a caution that grows stronger the more one studies the region. Human communities do not always leave their clearest identity in the form we most want, which is perhaps the right note to carry forward, because once language, culture, ancestry and landscape have all refused to collapse into a single neat answer, the larger significance of the Tarim mummies comes into focus. They are not only interesting because they were preserved, or because their DNA surprised people, or because later scholars argued about what language they may have spoken. They matter because they force us to think more carefully about what human history actually looks like when we stop demanding that it behave. What the Tarim mummies tell us about human history is, first of all, that history is much less tidy than people prefer. For a long time, the easiest version of this story was that strange-looking Bronze Age mummies appeared in Western China because a recognisable group had migrated in from elsewhere, bringing their ancestry, their lifeways, and perhaps even their language in one neat package. The genomic evidence broke that expectation. The 2021 Nature study found that the earliest Tarim Basin individuals studied, dated to roughly 2100 to 1700 BCE, did not match the main origin stories scholars had proposed for them. Instead of turning out to be straightforward descendants of Afanasyevo steppe herders, BMA sea oasis farmers, or another obvious incoming Bronze Age group, they appear to have arisen from a genetically isolated local population that adopted neighbouring pastoralist and agriculturalist practices. That is already a large lesson. Human communities do not always fit the stories that look most elegant on a map. It also tells us that ancestry and culture are not the same thing, even when they appear to point in the same direction. The Tarim mummies were genetically distinctive, but they were not culturally cut off. The same Nature study found strong evidence of milk proteins in dental calculus from Xiaohe, showing reliance on dairy pastoralism from the site's earliest phase. And the Max Planck summary emphasises that these Bronze Age people built their cuisine around wheat and dairy from West Asia, millet from East Asia, and medicinal plants such as ephedra from Central Asia. In other words, they were borrowing, learning and adapting across a wide network of neighbouring traditions while still remaining, at the genetic level, unusually isolated. That matters because one of the oldest habits in ancient history is to assume that if people share crops, technologies, clothing styles or ritual practices, they must also be recent biological kin. The Tarim evidence says that assumption is often too simple. That same point reaches beyond the Tarim Basin. Human history is full of cases where objects travel farther than people, where techniques spread faster than genes, and where languages can move through elite influence, trade, marriage, ritual, or gradual adoption, rather than wholesale population replacement. The Tarim mummies make that general truth unusually vivid, because the contrast is so sharp. Their graves, foodways, and pastoral practices make them look connected to larger Bronze Age currents across Inner Asia. Their genomes tell us that this connection did not require them to be a mass colony from somewhere else. They could remain rooted while still changing. They could stay biologically distinctive while becoming culturally flexible. That is a much better model for understanding many ancient societies, especially in frontier or oasis environments, than the old habit of dividing the world into static populations that only change when one clearly named group marches in and replaces another. The mummies also tell us that isolation and connectivity are not opposites. Modern people often imagine remote landscapes in one of two ways. Either they are sealed off and untouched, or they are crossroads where everyone mixes all at once. The Tarim Basin was neither in such a simple form. It was a difficult oasis world where a population could remain surprisingly isolated for a long time, while still participating in wide cultural exchange. Nature study places this very clearly in the setting of the shifting riverine oases of the Taklamakan Desert. The Max Planck summary describes Xinjiang as a major intersection of trans-Eurasian exchanges of people, agriculture, cultures and languages. Both are true. The basin was connected, but connection did not erase local continuity immediately. That is a valuable lesson because many ancient landscapes work the same way. Marginal environments often produce exactly this combination. Deep local adaptation with selective outside contact. Another thing they tell us is that the past preserves older ancestry in uneven ways. The researchers concluded that the earliest Tarim mummies were descendants of a population related to Ancient North Eurasians, a lineage that had once been more widespread in Pleistocene Eurasia, but later survived mostly in diluted form within other populations. The Max Planck summary describes the Tarim mummies as a local indigenous Bronze Age population with deep Asian roots, and the broader ancient DNA work on Ancient North Eurasians shows that later populations often carry this ancestry only as one fraction among several. That means the Tarim people were not bizarre outsiders or a separate category of humanity. They were a surviving branch of a much older population history, preserved in unusual clarity because of long isolation. Human history often works this way. Some ancient lineages do not disappear cleanly. They linger in fragments, in pockets, and in combinations that later become difficult to recognize without genetics. That, in turn, warns us against reading too much from appearance alone. The Tarim mummies became famous because their preserved faces and clothing seemed to contradict modern expectations about what early populations in Western China should have looked like. The visual shock encouraged decades of speculation about migrants from the West, proto-Turkarians, or lost ancestors from steppe and oasis civilizations. But the genomic study rejected those earlier origin stories for the earliest Tarim mummies. The lesson is not that faces tell us nothing. Faces matter. Physical traits are real. The lesson is that resemblance is not identity, and visible traits do not automatically reveal recent ancestry, language, or historical origin. A face can invite a question, but it cannot finish the answer on its own. Human beings are very prone to believing otherwise, especially when the ancient dead are preserved so well that they seem almost ready to speak for themselves. The Tarim case also tells us that ancient DNA is most useful when it complicates a story rather than simply confirming what everyone already wanted to believe. It would have been easy and in some ways disappointing if the genomic evidence had neatly confirmed one of the older theories. Instead, it forced a better distinction between biology, culture, and language. Nature's authors explicitly say their results do not support the earlier hypotheses that link the Tarim mummies directly to Afanasyevo proto-Tocharian pastoralists, BMA sea founders, or Eurasian mountain corridor populations as primary founders. But the same paper leaves open the possibility that Tocharian may have been introduced to the broader region by Afanasyevo migrants through the Dzungarian Basin. That is exactly the kind of outcome good science often produces. It does not replace a simple myth with another simple myth. It sorts the problem into smaller, more accurate pieces and leaves the genuinely unresolved parts unresolved. There is also a lesson here about the difference between the earlier stage of a region's history and what comes later. One reason the Tarim story caused so much confusion is that people were mixing several different time layers together. The earlier studied Tarim mummies belonged to a distinctive local genetic isolate, but a later 2025 current biology study of Western Tarim individuals from the Bronze and Iron Ages found a different picture in other parts of the basin. Bronze Age Western Tarim groups derived most of their ancestry from steppe pastoralists. Those migrants first mixed with BMA sea-related populations, and indigenous Tarim ancestry persisted into Iron Age groups across the basin. That means the basin did become more genetically mixed over time. The earlier expectation that the Tarim would eventually look like a crossroads was not completely wrong. It was simply wrong for the earlier Xiaohe-centered phase that had captured the imagination first. Timing, as so often in history, matters nearly as much as identity. That later evidence gives us another important lesson. Local populations do not always vanish when bigger population movements arrive. The 2025 study reports that indigenous ancestry persisted in Iron Age groups across the Tarim Basin, and even identifies an Iron Age individual in the Western Basin who appears largely unaffected by the main steppe influx. The authors describe this as evidence of a long-lasting indigenous legacy enduring for more than 1,000 years. That matters because history is often narrated in terms of arrivals, while survivals are treated as background. We notice incoming steppe groups, incoming religions, incoming languages, incoming empires. We are less practiced at noticing the persistence of older local peoples within the new mixture. The Tarim evidence reminds us to watch for continuity as carefully as we watch for change. The mummies also show that small communities in hard environments can be historically important without ever becoming empires. There is a tendency in broad history to focus on large states, long-distance trade networks, famous conquerors, and literate civilizations with grand architecture. The Yahweh people had none of the usual publicity machines. What they had was a difficult oasis environment, a cattle-centered economy, dairying, mixed cereals, boat-shaped coffins, and an unusual ability to preserve ancient ancestry. Yet they matter greatly because they expose how much of human history was made by small-scale populations adapting to marginal landscapes and surviving there long enough to shape later worlds in quiet ways. Human history is not only the story of centres, quite often it is the story of edges that persisted. They also remind us that categories like East and West can become unhelpful very quickly. A great deal of the public fascination around the Tarim mummies came from the idea that they looked Western while being found in what is now China. But the genetic findings do not support the simplistic notion that they were simply Western migrants misplaced on an Eastern map. The Max Planck summary describes them instead as a local indigenous population with deep Asian roots, and the Nature paper frames them as descendants of a genetically isolated local population in Inner Asia. That does not make the visible features unreal. It makes the labels too blunt. Ancient Eurasia was not divided into modern civilizational blocks waiting politely for future audiences to categorize them. It was full of populations whose ancestries cut across the terms we inherited later. The Tarim mummies expose the weakness of those categories because they refuse to stay comfortably on one side of them. The relationship between the Tarim mummies and later populations offers a more mature lesson about descent as well. Modern people often want ancient remains to belong cleanly to someone alive now. They want a straight line, a national heir, a modern group that can be declared the clear continuation. But the genomic picture here is much more distributed. The specific early Tarim genetic profile does not survive intact in any living population sample so far, yet traces of that ancestry linger in later and present-day groups. A 2022 study of modern Central Asians reported additional gene flow from the Tarim mummies into Highland Tajik populations, while still showing that modern Tajik ancestry is largely built from other Bronze Age mixtures. That is a much more realistic model for how many ancient populations persist. They do not remain whole. They're absorbed, layered, redistributed, and remembered unequally. There is also a methodological lesson. The Tarim mummies became famous because the desert preserved bodies so well that people could build dramatic narratives around them. But those same preserved bodies became most historically valuable when multiple methods were applied together. Archaeology gave us the graves, coffins, textiles, food remains, and environmental setting. Proteomics gave us milk proteins in dental calculus. Genomics gave us ancestry structure. Later population studies showed how that ancestry changed through the Bronze and Iron Ages. None of those lines of evidence alone would have told the full story. Human history, especially deep prehistory, is rarely recoverable through a single method. The Tarim case is one of the clearest modern examples of why archaeology works best, when it stops asking one discipline to do everyone else's job. And then there is the broader philosophical lesson, if one can call it that without sounding too pleased with oneself. The Tarim mummies tell us that human history is braided rather than linear. That is an inference, of course, but it is a grounded one. In the Tarim Basin, old ancestry persisted locally while new practices arrived from multiple directions. Later steppe populations entered the region in more than one wave. BMA, sea-related ancestry mixed in at different stages. Indigenous ancestry endured. Languages in the later basin were multiple, not singular. The region became a meeting place, but not all at once and not in one uniform pattern. That is not an exception to human history. It is a particularly visible example of how human history usually behaves when we stop flattening it into arrows on a map. Perhaps the most human lesson of all is that people do not need to be globally famous to be globally revealing. The Siauhe community were not writing manifestos about identity. They were herding animals, processing milk, using wheat and millet, burying their dead in coffins made from materials that made sense in their world, and surviving in a difficult oasis landscape. And yet, because the desert preserved them and science arrived late enough to ask better questions, they have ended up clarifying some of the biggest issues in Eurasian prehistory: how populations move, how cultures spread, how ancestry persists, and how often visual first impressions are wrong. That is one of history's more reliable habits. Ordinary people in remote places often end up telling us the most important things. So what the Tarim mummies tell us, in the end, is not that history is mysterious in the cheap sense, not that everything is unknowable, and not that every ancient body belongs to some lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered by a dramatic narrator standing in wind. They tell us something better. They tell us that the past is full of real communities whose lives were practical, local, and deeply adapted to their surroundings, and that those communities can still overturn large assumptions about the human story thousands of years later. They tell us that ancestry can survive without staying pure forever, that culture can travel without dragging whole populations behind it, that language cannot be read directly from a skull, and that the edges of the map are often where the clearest corrections begin. And that may be why these mummies remain so compelling, not because they confirm an old legend, but because they quietly force us to imagine human history as it was more often lived, mixed, local, surprising, and far less obedient than the stories we first told about it.